Hello everyone. It's quite ready. Hello everyone. Let's see. I'm just going to open up my file with the kings in it. Unfortunately, Tier List Maker refuses to work tonight, so I have no choice but to go without the site. There's Tier Maker, which is a completely useless program. I have no idea how anyone has ever gotten that to work in the history of ever. So, yeah, I've tried it in the past. It has never operated. So I usually use tierlist.com, which is normally more functional, but it struggles mightily anytime you do a big list. So that one tonight is not working. I've tried it on a couple different browsers. Can't get it to load. Maybe I just have too much info since I'm trying to upload about 48 graphics. I had a few extras, but mostly we're rating, I believe it's 45 total leaders from Macedon, some of whom were formal kings, some of whom were not. So before we get into the individual monarchs, there were a couple things I wanted to address. People were asking me what it's like to defend a dissertation. Basically, the people who question you are people you've selected, people you've worked with in the past, typically. And then there's a sort of random wildcard person who's from a different department, who is appointed by the grad school. You don't really get a choice over who that person is. And then they give you some random questions, usually. Sometimes they're directly related to the dissertation itself, especially if they have some objections to what you've done or if they have questions about your methodology. But the people on my committee weren't all that interested in the specifics of what I did because they didn't really have any objections to that. So we're trying to look at sort of the presuppositions of my work. So we ended up talking about stuff that was a little more in their wheelhouse than mine. So I was sort of getting grilled on random things like Enlightenment philosophers for about half of my dissertation defense. So half of my defense had literally nothing to do with my dissertation. It was a very odd experience, but at the same time, my advisor told me afterwards that's a good sign because it means no one had any real objections. And they were just looking for something to sort of say, see, there's something you don't know. Because it's kind of like this thing where, if you're a professor, you're supposed to be a lifelong learner, and you get the idea. So that was pretty, I guess in that sense, it was a good defense, and also the people I had on my committee are notoriously tough, so I guess in relative terms, even though it felt pretty rough, I guess it wasn't that bad. But anyway, so I survived, I passed, that's what really matters in the end. Got a quick super chat from Diogenes. What's up, man? Been diving deep into Hellenistic history. Thank you, Diogenes, by the way. Seen any good YouTube channels about the subject? Also, new Byzantine video, when no one makes them like you. Constantine the Eighth. I was planning actually to do that on Friday, but I didn't get around to it because this week ended up being way busier than I thought. As I've mentioned before, I have a new puppy. That's, a time-consuming member of the household. My mom decided to come up to visit sort of at random, so a lot of the weekend went that way. Yeah, so, stuff like that happens. In terms of, so that'll be, Constantine the Eighth will be this week. I don't know exactly what day, but that's my next video for sure, because I already have all the research done. All I got to do is really just record it at this point. Any subjects on any channels on Hellenistic history? Not that I'm aware of. Actually, if anything, of all of the ancient topics I can think of, and this applies both to YouTube and to popular presses, and also to academic presses, Hellenistic history is easily the most neglected topic in antiquity right now. And I don't think it's that close, by the way. And the weird thing about that is there actually are enough sources to do a fair amount in the Hellenistic world, but not a lot of people do. And that's something I actually happen to know a fair amount about because that's what I worked on during my master's program. So in the future, I plan to do more Hellenistic stuff, including on the Antigonids and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the Aetolian League and the Achaean League. So what we'll do is I'll just pull up the... Oh, there's apparently a podcast in the Hellenistic Age. Anyway, I'll pull up the images, I'll talk about a few of them at a time, and I'll tell you how I'd rank them if we had an actual tier ranking available. Then I'll keep checking back every once in a while to make sure the sound is still working, since that was a problem a couple weeks ago. And I also have some preliminary remarks just on Macedonian history in general. So, As you all know, Macedon was a peripheral area in the Greek world. This means that Macedon was not at the heart of Greek civilization. It was not one of the richer areas. It didn't have very large cities. There wasn't a lot of literary activity going on. And it developed at a sort of stagnated rate when compared with, say, Athens or Sparta, or the wealthy Greek cities of Sicily, such as Syracuse. It does appear that from the beginning the Macedonians were Greeks, although they did speak sort of a dialect which was not easily intelligible to most other Greeks. They also had a lot of influence from their neighbors, the Illyrians and the Thracians. They had a lot of loanwords. This led to a lot of issues later on in Macedonian history, as their Greekness was frequently brought into question. And this has also lent itself to a lot of current debates where people debate whether the modern Republic of Macedon or the modern country of Greece gets credit for ancient Macedon. I find that debate to be insufferably stupid and pointless, as are all debates where you're just trying to claim credit and enhance yourself by claiming ancestors. Is kind of pathetic. Why not do something in the present? Make yourself relevant rather than relying upon your pedigree. Anyway, that's just my thought on that particular form of identity politics, which I find to be mindless and pointless. So, a couple different things to note about, now that we know that the Macedonians were constantly on the defensive when it came to proving their identity. One use of Greek mythology is to establish one's bona fides, to establish one's credibility, one's ancestry, and the importance of said ancestry. And we know for a fact, by other examples, that mythology often did change in response to the times. So each polis in Greece had its own sort of little variants on mythology. Their gods were just a little different, and their versions of stories and events were a bit different. So Heracles, for instance, better known to most audiences in the West as Hercules, was known throughout the Greek world, but he was known more to the Dorians than to, say, the Ionians. So once the Ionians learn about him, they managed to cut themselves in on the story. So he also visited our city and did these cool things. That kind of thing. We also know in Athens that Theseus was a long-standing local hero. So once they went democratic, they decided that Theseus was the founder of democracy, which makes no sense since he was a king. But in certain plays written in the late 5th, early 4th centuries, Theseus is portrayed as the founder of democracy. Also, after the Athenians became a democracy, they became more interventionist with their neighbors. And then all of a sudden it turns out that Theseus not only slayed monsters at home, but he also went around the Saronic Gulf and slayed monsters. So he was a protector of a lot of people along the coast in Athens' backyard. Who would have guessed? And those stories just miraculously appear right when Athens goes imperial. Well, with Macedon, we see that there are two big periods where they suddenly discover more lost ancestors. And those two periods correspond with the reigns of Alexander the First, who is contemporary with the Persian War, and Archelaus the First, who, as you can see from the picture, was a friend and contemporary of Euripides, so late Peloponnesian War. So the idea was that over time, they were trying to dig themselves deeper and deeper into Greek history to gain more sympathy and legitimacy. So, for instance, if you look at Herodotus and Thucydides, they think that the first ever monarch in history for the Macedonians was Perticus I. Wait, okay, the order got a little messed up here. It actually should be, Perticus should actually be number 6 on this list, but partly I would have gotten away with this if the tier list had worked better, because all of these are the same to represent sort of generic kings we don't know much about. So, according to both Herodotus and Thucydides, Perticus was the first king. Now, Thucydides actually doesn't say it directly, but what he does say is that he ranks, I forget which king he's talking about, but he says they were so many, like the 4th or 5th Macedonian king ever. And if you date back, that would only get you to what is now number 6 on the list, Perticus I. And then in the time of Archelaus, he dates it back by another 5. So he adds to the list. Or wait, no, he adds Cairneus, Cairneus, and Tiramus. So he only adds 3, I'm sorry. Actually, Perticus should be number 4. And then Argius, then Philip. So it should go Cairneus, Cairneus, Tiramus, Perticus, Argius, Philip. Another thing to keep in mind about these ancient kings, at least these sort of early kings, is that they are attested for the Archaic era, which is really when Greek history begins in earnest. This is when we get the first Greek writing. Both Homer and Hesiod were more or less composed around the year 700, give or take. And depending on which interpretation you follow, there are people who have tried to create dates for these early kings to date them back all the way to 800. There are other people who have gone with more modest dates of rule to correspond with more typical times for humans to live and reign. And then they only date it back to about 650 or so. Most scholars go with the 650 BCE date as sort of a plausible beginning for a Macedonian kingdom. I tend to agree with that because the Greek world was growing pretty rapidly once you get past 700, and it would make sense that you would have some state formation up near the city of Aegis. So, that is that. And with that, we can get into the confusing made-up history of early Macedon. Unfortunately for us, the Macedonians, at least in the early years, were a lot less creative when it came to making up stuff about their early past than, say, the Romans were with Livy. So yes, Livy's kings, the early kings of Rome, are basically all made-up figures. I hope I haven't broken anyone's heart, but it's true. The Macedonians also have some made-up kings, but unfortunately most of them seem to serve little more than etymological functions. First on that list is our good friend Cairneus. So the first dynasty we'll be talking about are variously known as the Argids. That's the typical name most people today use because of the Argive origin of the family, supposedly. Another name for them is the Timonids, after Temenus, who was a descendant of Heracles. It looks like the ancient evidence favors the name Timonids as being more contemporaneous, as being what people at the time would have recognized as being more legitimate. But we can use both. It's fine, it doesn't really matter as long as we are all clear on what we mean. So Cairneus, who, if you use the more Hellenized spelling, would be Karanos. He is the son of the Argive king Temenus. Temenus, of course, as I mentioned, was a descendant of Heracles, and there was a period in Argive history where Temenus was supposed to be one of the major players in Greece. Of course, this is basically mythology rather than history. The story goes that when Temenus died, Cairneus lost the scramble for the throne to his brother Phaedon. Phaedon supposedly brought Argos to the height of its power in the Archaic period, and this is when Argos' long rivalry with Sparta supposedly started. I've made a video on Argos where I talk about why that's probably not accurate, and there's no real evidence of the Argives having this great empire at this time. At any rate, though, Phaedon does loom large in the Greek imagination in the classical period because of his supposed greatness in the Archaic period. So being the brother of that guy is pretty cool. Cairneus took his friends and went north, and they were seeking rich land that would have game and opportunity. They had gone to an oracle, and the oracle told them to go find a land that would be rich and full of opportunity. So they went north, and apparently he became a goat herd, as one does when you're in the middle of nowhere. Or, I'm getting the story confused. Hold on, my notes are messed up here. So, okay, I'm sorry, I mixed it up with an alternative version of the story. So there's one version where they come from Argos. There's another version where they were local goat herds. And then they founded Aegis, which means goat area or something like that. And then there's another theory that they started out based in the valley of the Haliacmon and grew from there, that they were a local dynasty and they made up their heritage later. So there are a lot of views on how they came to be, or how someone like Cairneus could have possibly existed in some form or fashion. Anyway, most of what we know about Cairneus comes to us via the later historians of the 4th century, Theopompus, and a guy named Marissus of Pella, who supposedly is like a half-brother of Antigonus the One-Eyed, somebody I'd never heard of before I read up on this topic. So anyway, Cairneus is pretty unrankable, so if I had my list right now, I'd put him at a U. He probably didn't exist, so that makes him unrankable. Although there are some of these guys who their lives seem to be stand-ins for qualities that kings are supposed to display, so I think we actually can rank them, even if they're not quite historical. So Cairneus would be a U. His son and successor was Cairneus. And by the way, the word Cairneus in Dorian Greek means lord or ruler. So pretty generic name, kind of like the name of, say, Archon in a lot of Athenian plays. Archon just means leader. So it's a pretty generic name. Next up is Cairneus. In Dorian, this means what koinos means in Attic, which is common. So again, it seems like a lazily made-up name that serves an etymological function. He's a common ancestor. The only thing that happens in his life in Marissus' account is this. Cairneus and the boy's mother are debating what to name him when he's born. And one of them wants to name him after their own father, but then a man is present at court named Nopus of Colchis, and he basically just suggests that they name him Cairneus. I guess because they have him in common, so he's their common possession, and he'll be the common ancestor. And that's all we know about him, and then supposedly he reigned for about 30 years. But didn't really do anything that anyone bothered to write down, because he's made up. So he's another U. After him, we have the person who I spent the most time trying to find literally anything on, and couldn't. Tiramus, the third of these kings, another one who was added by Archelaus. He is the son and successor of Cairneus. He supposedly ruled for 50 years, but apparently did so little that no one bothered to record anything he did. So it's almost as if he was completely made up. Another U. And before we get to Perticus the First, who's a little more plausible and was introduced by Alexander the First, I will go ahead and make sure sound is still working real fast. Okay. All right. A couple of super chats, and we'll return to talk about Perticus the First. Taco Cruiser, $5. Thank you, Taco. Did the Greeks view the Macedonians as barbarians on the same level as the Illyrians and Thracians, or did they view them more as cousins? It depends on which Greek you're talking about. So if you're more pro-Macedonian, which Herodotus very much was, Herodotus very much believed in the Greekness of the Macedonians, and he was an outright fanboy of Alexander the First, as we'll discuss later. He definitely believed in their Greekness, as did all of the various Athenians who went to the court, including, well, he didn't go to the court, but Isocrates in the 4th century very much believed in the Greekness of the Macedonians and became a fanboy of Philip II. On the other hand, Demosthenes, who was the archenemy of Philip, often said that Philip was uncultured and barbaric, and that he was no different than any other barbarian out there and couldn't be trusted, had no love for the Greeks, etc. And what's interesting there is that the people who met Philip and liked him talk about how cultured he was, how well-spoken he was, how well-read he was, but then the people who hated Philip said he was just a gross, drunk brute who had no culture of any kind. It's almost as if they were politicking and exaggerating. Weird, huh? And I'm sure that views did vary. There were probably people more in the middle saying they're more like cousins than either kinsmen or strangers. So, but the thing is, I I don't think there were too many people who took that kind of a moderate stance and made it into the sources that survived. So most sources are either saying that Philip and his men are all a bunch of barbarians or their fellow Greeks. Nicholas, $5 Canadian, do an S-tier tournament. That would be a tough tournament, but, it could work. Recall that Elagabalus would be among the participants. Yeah, so whoever gets matched up against him, should count their lucky stars. Recall that I'm expecting a certain result and my dad can ban you. I will do. We're definitely going to do an F-tier tournament at some time, so be on the lookout for that. I assume sound is still going on, and we will jump back into these fine, fine gentlemen who ruled Macedon, including the ones who didn't actually live. After him, we have Perticus the First, who has a relatively decent chance of existing. I would say 50-50 chance Perticus the First is a real guy. So in Herodotus' narrative, which ultimately derived from Alexander the First, Perticus was the youngest of three sons who descended from Temenus, and the three brothers entered into Upper Macedonia after venturing around in Illyria for a while. They came to work for a local king in the area, so possibly by Upper Macedon they mean the Lyncestian kingdom, which we won't really get into much now, but suffice it to say that there was at one time more than one Macedonian kingdom. We're only talking about the main one at Agia and later Pella, the one that produces the guys you've heard of, frankly. Anyway, they entered into the service of this king. Apparently this was a very small-scale operation, and they lived in the house. There were so few servants that the king's wife actually prepared all the food for the brothers. And when the brothers would eat, the king's wife would notice that when she would put bread in the oven, that the loaf that she would designate for Perticus would always blossom to twice what it should be. So she told her husband about this, and he was alarmed. He thought this was a very negative sign. So he became upset and fearful of Perticus and his ambitions, and decided to banish the brothers without paying them. So the two older brothers demanded pay, and the king laughed them off, and he said, pointing to a sort of hole on the floor, that they could have everything that the light was shining on. There was apparently a smoke hole in the ceiling, and you could see some sunlight streaming down onto the floor, which I assume, based on the context of the story, must have been a dirt floor. The two brothers were outraged because they wanted their money, but Perticus put his cloak around this hole and then cut some of the dirt and took it with him. And the king afterwards thought about this, and he thought, that's odd. That seems like something I should be worried about. Holy shit, he's planning to take my land. So then he sends out his cavalry to try to pursue the brothers. He fails, and ultimately Perticus and his brothers set up a kingdom in the north that becomes a rival and over time begins to grow. So if you're looking at this as sort of a moralistic tale, which I think in many ways it is, we see a lot of things that are designed to appeal to the Greek understanding of history. So as I mentioned, Alexander the First is the guy who presents all of this to the Greeks to try to really impress upon them that he is in fact one of them. So what we see is pastoralism, something that a lot of Greeks can relate to, goat herding, and the idea of it being a rural frontier area. We also see the idea of these kings as being kind of a throwback to a bygone era because the north is supposed to be backward and behind the times. And we also see just the idea of simplicity too. The idea that this Argid family came from very noble origins but then had to get a humble reboot in the north. And that this humble reboot in the middle of nowhere may have caused a sort of cultural divergence over time. And also we see that cavalry plays a role. And before it became known for its pikemen and all of that under Philip and Alexander, the one thing Macedon was good at was having a good mounted arm. Before that, actually, its infantry totally sucked. But we'll come to that later when we talk about Philip II's reforms. So, basically, yeah, both Herodotus and Thucydides understand Perticus I as the first king of Macedon, and their ultimate source of information would have been Alexander I and his various envoys over the years. And if we take Perticus I seriously as the first founder, and we estimate about 25 to 35 years per king, which again is a little optimistic because most people don't just have a neat lifespan generation after generation where everything's nice and even and neat. But if we do assume that, then this would put the foundation of Macedon around 650 or so BCE. And then after Perticus, after we have this great story, most of the next kings that we'll talk about are mere names until we get to Amentos the First and his son Alexander the First. Perticus the First, if he is indeed a founder, I think has to get at least a C rather than a U, though, because he's the first person we can verify is supposed to have done something. So, just founding a kingdom of itself, I think, deserves at least a C. You can also make a good case for U, but whenever possible, I prefer to rank. And also, I should mention, while we're on the topic, that like I said earlier, the archaic period is so poorly documented that sometimes you just kind of have to go with what little is available, no matter how made up it seems, if you're trying to do a tier ranking and make it fun or interesting. So, next up we have Argius the First, the son and successor of Perticus. As you can tell from his name, this could very easily serve as an eponymous name for the house, the Argid dynasty. But again, if we think, like many scholars do now, that the house was actually called the Timinid dynasty instead, then maybe that's not so convincing after all. And actually, there is one fact about Argius the First, but it doesn't come to us from anything nearly contemporaneous, but rather from the 2nd century CE writer, a Macedonian named Polyaenus, who has a book about stratagems. Interestingly enough, Polyaenus describes him as the first ever Macedonian king, which is weird, and that's the only time, to the best of my knowledge, that he's described as the founder of the Macedonian kingdom. So I guess that's yet another version of how this family got going, and how the kingdom began. But anyway, Polyaenus says that at one time, there was an invasion by the Talanti tribe under King Alaris, and that somehow Argius was able to repel this invasion with a ruse where he dressed a bunch of women up as men and had them act out a Dionysian rite. Apparently this created enough confusion that this presumably Illyrian leader decided to call it quits. Not a very plausible story, but there it is. The one thing we can say about this guy, safe to say, he is a U. Next up is Philip the First of Macedon. Supposedly, he repelled at least one Illyrian invasion in his lifetime, but then he gained sort of what little claim to notoriety he had by dying in battle against the Illyrians, something that many of his successors would also do. And he left an infant son in command of Macedon. Because he did his duty and died heroically the way that Macedonian kings were expected to, I have to give him a C. Now, most likely, his sacrifice is supposed to be a stand-in for what kings later on were expected to do, so it's supposed to be a precedent that they're supposed to follow. But nonetheless, as a precedent and as a rhetorical tool, Philip I is still effective, so he's a C. Philip I was succeeded by his son Eurypus I. By now, we're around the early 6th century, so we're entering into, say, the 590s or so, the era of Solon of Athens, assuming that this timeline is accurate. The Talanti are still invading at this time. Philip I has just died in battle, and the Macedonians need their king to guide them. So in the absence of an adult king, the story goes that they took their infant's crib, put it behind their line, to fight more desperately because they had to defend their king, and they were so inspired by the need to defend their rightful king that they managed to drive off this tribe. Also, when he grew up and came of age, according to Plutarch's Life of Demetrius, Eurypus I became an avid builder of tables and lampstands. Yeah, Plutarch is just full of random shit like this. So, basically, the story of Eurypus I is the story of how the Macedonians really loved the Argid dynasty, and also how supposedly the Macedonian people were diehard loyalists, and the king should be able to command the respect of his men even when he is not able to actually exercise power. I assume the story was largely invented just to try to shame future regents into being loyal to infant kings or their charges. But nonetheless, Euripides serves as an interesting reminder to kings of the future and regents of the future to do their duty, and a reminder to the people to be loyal to the Argid family, which they largely were right up until the end. So I still have to give Euripides a C, because as a symbol, he is still relatively effective, whether or not he actually existed or did any of this stuff. And when I heard that he likes to make tables and lampstands, it kind of put me in mind of Louis XVI of France, who famously loved to build locks. So I guess this would be about the closest equivalent you could get to that time. Although, to be fair to Euripides, whether or not he existed, we have no real evidence that he was incompetent. So he's got that going over Louis XVI, at least. Next up is Alcitus the First. One thing that he did do is serve as a namesake for the successor Alcitus, who, as we discussed a couple years ago, was flamingly incompetent. Supposedly, this Alcitus ruled from 576 to 547, but we don't know anything about him whatsoever. He's a U. Next up is the first king that is definitely historical. So now we're at 100% chance this person lived. We actually have a coin from his reign. So he was alive during the latter half of the 6th century, and most likely died around 498-ish, maybe? And it's also possible that he sort of initiated the trend toward trying to sell the Greeks on Macedon belonging to their community. Alexander the First is usually associated with this because he competed in the Olympics and therefore established Macedonian Greekness, at least for the ruling family, maybe not for everybody else, but he would have only been able to do this under his father's protection. Most scholars think Alexander the First went to the Olympics around 504, so his father would have had to lay the groundwork for that. And we also see that during this time there's a lot more contact between Macedon and the outside Greek world. This is the period during which the Greeks are starting to build triremes for the first time. And to build a proper trireme, you need access to Macedonian timber and pitch. So this means that Amentos now has an export that he can work with. And we see a pretty big increase in the archaeological record of local wealth. We also see a lot more complex graves in Agai and some of the other cities up north, including Pydna and Methone, which, to be fair, are Greek cities, but they're still within the Macedonian orbit. We also see cremation coming about in Macedon, so we see a lot of cultural changes at the time. And Amentos the First is able to grant an estate to the exiled former tyrant of Athens, Hippias. So this begins a long and very tumultuous relationship between Athens and Macedon. He also receives envoys from Persia and arranges for a Persian satrap named Barbares to marry his daughter Gygia. And this will prove to be very important during the reign of his son Alexander the First, who will need his Persian connections to basically get away with treason over and over and over against Persia. Amentos the First is a little hard to rank, but just based on the fact that Macedon grew stronger and richer under his reign, I'm leaning favorably. At the same time, however, this was during the time of Darius, and it would appear that Amentos did not put his son in a position that was strong enough to evade the yoke of Persia. I would give Amentos the First a B. I think that's probably about as high as I can go, given that his son was in an unfavorable position once Persia came knocking. Now we have the first truly great Macedonian leader, Alexander the First. He came to power around 498. He is probably the Macedonian who first fully established Macedonian Greekness, at least for the ruling class. And he became a hero of the Persian Wars. He's right up there with Leonidas and Themistocles in terms of his fame. Maybe a little bit below them, but still, he was a figure who absolutely fascinated Herodotus, who wrote a couple generations later. And clearly, Herodotus was an outright fan of Alexander the First. If you went into Herodotus' house, I have to guess that if he could have gotten a bust of Alexander the First, he would have definitely had it on his mantle. Alexander is clearly a very charismatic figure, very physically active. As I mentioned, he competed in the Olympics in 504. From what I understand, he won an event. I think it was a foot race event, if I'm not mistaken. When the Persians established their hegemony over the Thracians and Macedonians, Alexander had to accept a subordinate rank. During the 480 invasion of Xerxes, Alexander was forced to accompany the Persian horde as it swept south, but he leaked information to the Greeks often enough that he was effectively a double agent. During 480, when the Greeks wanted to make a stand in the north with their advance force, they were about to get flanked and destroyed by the Persians, who were going to come around their rear at Tempa, and it was due to Alexander's information that the Greek force extricated itself and avoided destruction. The next year, at the Battle of Plataea in 479, Xerxes had left and left his cousin Mardonius in charge. Alexander once again was present with the Persian force in Boeotia to fight at Plataea, and he provided the Greek commanders Pausanias, the regent of Sparta, and Aristides, the Athenian, with vital intelligence which enabled them to hold their course and know what the Persians were planning. So that's part of why they didn't withdraw sooner, because they knew that Mardonius was hoping that they would retreat during the day and allow his cavalry to really run rampant. So he is considered a hero for both those things, at least among the Greeks who stayed loyal. And the fact that he Medized was never held against him or his people, so that's a pretty big win in terms of diplomatic standing for Macedon. Later on, after Mardonius is killed in battle and his forces are retreating post-haste to try to get back to Asia, Alexander raises his army and goes after some refugees, supposedly slaying 43,000 Persians near a river under the command of Artabazdas. Of course, this puts Macedon at odds with Persia, but by this time the Persians have withdrawn into Asia, and now Alexander is a hero among the Greeks. So after the Persian wars, of course, Athens and Sparta are ascendant. Athens is on the offensive throughout the Aegean. Their navy's very active and it's growing. And Alexander and the Athenians are on great terms, so it's a win-win situation. The Macedonians make a lot of money off of the timber trade, and Alexander is set for life as a hero figure. Athens will only really become hostile to Macedon once Alexander dies around 454. From what it looks like. There were some setbacks later in his reign, however. Alexander at one point claimed Chalcidice, the Chalcidian peninsula, which has the area that would later become Amphipolis. At the time it was known as Aeneia Hodoi, 9 ways, but later it became Amphipolis, an Athenian colony. By 465 or so, Alexander had been expelled from the area by the Thracians, and then the Thracians and Athenians fought for control. So Alexander's prestige over time does decline some, but he still has this great standing. He's sort of one of the grand old men of international politics. When he dies in 454, however, the relationship between Athens and Macedon will begin to fray, and we will see that Athens begins to intervene more in Macedon's internal affairs. So, if I had to rank Alexander the First, I'd give him a solid A. I think that this guy was an excellent politician. He seems to have been a fairly competent commander, even if he clearly could not have been as good as some of his descendants, given that he couldn't hold on to the Chalcidian Peninsula. He also did not have the war machine that his successors had, so keep that in mind. Nonetheless, he did a great job of really establishing Macedon in international imagination, and he may have invented a number of ancestors for himself. We don't know. A lot of the things I just told you about the kings from Perticus forward may very well have been invented by Alexander. So, Either he invented these men out of whole cloth, or he just gave them stories that would make them interesting to the rest of the Greeks. So I would say pretty damn solid A. And before we get to his alcoholic son, represented ably by a bottle of Jim Beam, we'll check the chat real fast. So sound is still going. Cool. All right, back to our wonderful kings of Macedon. So Alexander the First had, and his oldest son was named Alcitus II. He ruled from 454 to 448. At this time, Athens was still relatively friendly-ish, but the interests of Macedon and Athens were beginning to clash, so that's becoming a bit of a problem. And this is at the heyday of Athenian imperialism, where the Athenians are at their boldest, and when they're willing to try damn near anything to gain an advantage. Alcitus also has to deal with a renewed Illyrian and Thracian threat. So the Thracians and Illyrians on his border, who are organized into various tribes, are becoming more active. So that will be a problem that Alcitus and his successors will face, which really only seems to emerge after his father was in the grave. The problem for Alcitus is that he has at least one brother who is disloyal, and another brother who's not willing to stand up for him. His youngest brother is Philip. Philip is not willing to help him, and his middle brother is Perticus, who is outright disloyal and has a son who's already an adult and is also disloyal. As you can tell from the bottle that represents Alcitus II, the man liked the drink, so he was not exactly what we'd call a great king. Nonetheless, he did attempt to, rule to the best of his ability in his sober moments, but that did not prevent him from being assassinated by his nephew Archelaus in 448, and Archelaus then handed the throne over to his father, Perticus II. Perticus II ruled from 448 to 413, and I think he's one of the better-known monarchs from Macedon because many people have read Thucydides, and Perticus II was king during the early phases of the Peloponnesian War. And in fact, one of the operations from the early Peloponnesian War period that a lot of people are aware of is Patadaya, and that whole operation in many ways is only a thing because of the actions of Perticus II. In 433, the Athenians are tired of dealing with Perticus II because he's trying to charge them more for timber, and again, they have a navy of about 300 ships at this point, so they need lots of timber and tar to keep that thing going. Perticus is trying to play hardball with them, so their plan is to support his brother Philip, and also support Dirdos, who is most likely an Illyrian chieftain of some kind, and basically just start a civil war and replace him in order to get a better deal on timber and tar, or pitch. So, he strikes back by aligning himself with the cities on the coast, which had fallen to the Delian League, which is basically the Athenian Empire by this point. So both are going after the weaknesses of the other, and really playing hardball. One of the cities on the coast is Patadaya. Now, Patadaya, more famously, is a Corinthian colony, and eventually the Corinthians will send ships to try to help their colonists against the Athenians. But the main source of aid and succor for Patadaya was actually Macedon, at least for most of this conflict. Once the Corinthians enter the fray, Athens actually makes a treaty with Perticus, especially after it becomes clear that their gambit with Philip and Dirdos has failed. Basically, what Perticus does is he signs the treaty and immediately breaks it, marches with an army to try to help the Patadaians. They fight a battle, the Athenians win. Remember, the Macedonian army can muster a fair amount of men, but they're not necessarily that great. So he loses the battle, and then the more famous events of the Athenians besieging the Patadaians, having an outbreak of plague, and all that occur. Later on, he asks Sparta to send a general north. And this helps give Sparta part of the idea for Brasidas' campaign. So Perticus remains very important in the war. However, Perticus is not just a homer for Sparta. I know in a lot of board games in the Peloponnesian War, the Macedonians are portrayed as just a satellite power who bounce between the two great powers and are just subjects. But Perticus was very much playing both against each other. So he calls for Spartan assistance in the north. And ostensibly, they think that he wants them to help win over the coast, and that's what Sparta wants to do because that hurts Athens the most. But Perticus' actual aim is to fight the Lyncestian Macedonians. So what he wants to do is get Brasidas up there with some men and say, actually, the time's not right. The Athenians there are too strong. Let's go take out the Lyncestians. I'll have a bunch more troops, then we can go fight the Athenians. But in reality, what he wanted to do was strengthen his own hand, and he didn't give a damn about Sparta or Athens. So he has mixed success with what he's trying to do. Brasidas obviously has a lot of success, and he does provide some aid to Perticus, including winning one battle over the Lyncestians, but obviously Brasidas was an intelligent commander and was not easily manipulated. So Perticus' ploy to try to defeat the Lyncestians with Spartan aid ultimately fails, but he does win a victory or two, and Brasidas does loosen up the Athenian hold, including capturing Amphipolis, which will not return for many decades. Later on, he actually reconciles with the Athenians. What it appears that what happens is that after he had invaded the Lyncestians with Brasidas, the Illyrians intervened, and then the Macedonians and Spartans ran, and while Brasidas was retreating through friendly territory, that is Perticus' territory, he laid waste. So at that point, Perticus thought, fuck Sparta. So he breaks off his alliance with Sparta, but goes neutral for a while. In 416, right before Sicily, the Athenians actually send troops into Macedon to raid. At this point, Perticus aligns himself with them because they're able to hurt him, and also he can sell stuff to them. They're massively building up their fleet in preparation to go to Sicily. In 414, when the Athenians send their second wave to Sicily, Perticus is now a firm ally because he's making lots of money off the Athenians. And then he dies the next year in 413 before news of the disaster in Sicily arrives. Perticus II, to me, is a solid C. I'd say he's an okay ruler. He has some successes and some failures. Ultimately, he is held back, however, by the inability of his army to win battles, something that his successors are keenly aware of, and something that his son and successor Archelaus will do a great deal to try to remedy. Of course, as you probably guessed, his reforms don't quite work as expected. Next up is a man who was friends with the man who is pictured here. This would be the playwright Euripides, but the king is Archelaus the First. As I mentioned, he had assassinated his uncle all the way back in 448, so he's already well in the middle age by the time he becomes king in 413, and he will rule until 399, the same year that Socrates was executed. So Archelaus I is one of the bigger what-ifs in Macedonian history. He's clearly a very capable and intelligent man. He's a man of great culture, and he really takes Alexander the First's tradition of having a rich court full of Greek intellectuals, and he really amps that up. He adds Euripides, and he also hosts many others. And to be fair to his grandfather Alexander actually hosted Pindar. I forgot to mention that. And Pindar, of course, is a huge deal in Greek poetry, but Archelaus has Euripides. So as soon as he takes control of Macedon, he receives news that the Athenian expedition to Sicily has been decimated. And for him, this is a sign that it is time to switch sides. The Athenians are on the ropes and surely are near defeat. So he breaks things off with them and begins to reform. But he also leaves his options open diplomatically. And by 407-6, he actually has restored his relations with Athens as it becomes clear that the Athenians have some staying power despite being massively reduced. And he's still selling them stuff and making money. And he's using that money to try to finance reforms, including military reforms. We don't know exactly what reforms he made, but apparently he impressed Thucydides, who praised his reforms. There's actually a passage from Thucydides which tells us most of what we know about Archelaus. I'll just quote the whole thing. Archelaus, son of Perticus, when he became king, built these fortresses that are now in the country, and cut straight roads, and in general organized his country for war by providing cavalry, arms, and other equipment beyond anything achieved by all the 8 kings who preceded him. As you might be able to tell by math, there were only however many kings before Perticus the First. I think we determined that was... Anyway, the point is that Cairneus and some of these other early kings would not have existed according to Thucydides if you do the math. I can't pretend I'm good at math, so I'm not going to try to give you a precise number here, but the point is that it doesn't add up if you do the math. Unless you assume that Thucydides had no idea about these early kings, who most likely were only invented by Archelaus. And in fact, how does Archelaus invent these kings? Well, Euripides mentions them in one of his plays, when he's at the court of Archelaus. So most likely Archelaus paid Euripides to really make his lineage a little deeper, and to really emphasize a closer link with Temenus and ultimately Heracles. We actually don't know that much about the final years of Archelaus, but we do know that he dies, and this really initiates a scramble for power. It is a rough 40 years after this, 30 to 40 years. And basically what happens is that Macedon... there are some conquests we got to talk about with Archelaus. So he does reform the army. We don't know exactly how, but he does make some military reforms, and apparently the Macedonian army becomes an ass-kicking machine for the first time. And he invades Thessaly, which is the region immediately to the south. It is rich, and its Greek credentials are a little more solid. He restores the Alciudi at Larissa, and he also annexes the northernmost province of Thessaly. And this will really prefigure how Philip will go about conquering Macedon, or conquering the areas around Macedon and building up the greater Macedonian state. So Archelaus is kind of laying the blueprint for this campaign. He wins a number of battles in the region, also now has the Alciudi as his effectively subordinates. And things are going well, but he dies in 399. One quick possibility is that he actually is a different Archelaus than the man who assassinated his uncle Alcitus II. So perhaps this was a different Archelaus and the sources got confused. If we think about it age-wise, it actually makes more sense if this was a different guy, because we know that Archelaus only had a very young son when he died in 399, but if he was alive and active back in 348, his son should probably be older. So actually, I think that Archelaus the First, now that I really think about it, probably a different Archelaus. Anyhow, he dies in 399. This leads to the accession of his son Orestes, who was still a young child. And Orestes has a guardian named Euripides. This will lead to some real confusion over the next several years. There aren't a lot of sources which really go into this. I believe Diodorus is the only real source, and he really doesn't care too much about the particulars of Macedonian court politics. Xenophon's Hellenica covers this period, but he's not that interested in the goings-on of the Macedonian court, which don't concern his hero, who is Agesilaus II of Sparta. So we'll go through these guys really quick, because we're about to hit a lot of U's and F's. So Orestes is a U just by virtue of not being an adult. Euripides stole power and then died of illness after 6 years. We don't know any of his deeds as king, but it doesn't look like he was doing that great of a job. Archelaus II might actually not have existed. He might be a confusion in our sources, who might have gotten him confused with one of the other kings this period. Some people have speculated he might be a lost nephew of Euripides II. He only really appears in attestations from a much later date, so most likely he wasn't real. If he was real, he died pretty quickly and didn't accomplish anything. He's a U. Next up is Amentos II. We know that he
came the power after the death of Euripides II. And all we know about him is that he might have actually been the same as Derdos. No. Okay, he was a Macedonian, but he might have been a brother-in-law or cousin-in-law of some kind to Derdos, the Illyrian chieftain, who had married one of Archelaus' daughters. And according to Aristotle, Derdos then murdered Amentos II. So he doesn't really live very long, maybe a couple years in the late 390s. He dies. Then we get Pausanias, who is a son of Euripides II. He is then assassinated confusingly by another man named Amentos, who is this Amentos III. So Pausanias rules for less than a year. Before him, Amentos maybe actually ruled for a couple months, now I think about it. Pausanias rules for a couple years, then gets assassinated. No, he's assassinated the same year, I'm sorry. Then we get to Argius II. So what happened was after Amentos killed Pausanias and declared himself king, Amentos was then deposed in turn by Argius II. We don't know what his claim was, but apparently he's part of the dynasty, one of the other branches that had not been royal until a few key deaths. He rules for 2 years, and then Amentos III comes back. Argius II, in my opinion, is an F. He had long enough to establish himself and didn't, so I'll give him an F. You can make a case for a U, but again, I like to rank if possible. And now we get to Amentos III, who is unique for a couple of things. One is that he has 3 sons who succeed to the throne back to back to back. Another thing is that his line will continue and all of his descendants will be vastly more famous than he is. Another thing is that he is one of the rare Macedonian rulers who dies peacefully. So in 369, he passes away quietly in his bed. As you might have noticed by now, most Macedonian kings either die in battle or get assassinated. This led to the famous formulation by, I believe it was either Borza or Hammond, one of the great scholars of Macedon, who said that Macedonia was an absolute monarchy tempered by assassination. And I think that's the best summary of how Macedon worked politically, actually. So Amentos, though, got to live out his life. He actually is the guy who basically undoes all of his cousin Archelaus' deeds, however, as he rules from a position of weakness. So he's still under immense pressure from the outside, and when he got restored against Argius II, he was forced to rely on the Thessalians for help. And because he had to rely on the Aleuadae of Larissa, he had to cede to them the areas of Thessaly that Archelaus had conquered. So there goes Archelaus' conquest. As for Amentos' claim to the throne, he is a great-grandson of Alexander the First. That would be the last ruler in his direct line. And his grandfather's name was Amentos. His father's name was Aridaeus. Famously, of course, there will be an Aridaeus in the family who will become important. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. We'll talk about him later. But that's where that name came from in terms of becoming relevant to the family as a whole. Amentos III did have some diplomatic chops, however, but he was never a very strong ruler. He had to make considerable trade concessions to the nearby Greek city of Olynthus. So Olynthus was the head of the Chalcidian League, so they controlled the area along the Macedonian and Thracian coast. And those concessions basically meant that the Olynthians became the middlemen between Macedon and Athens for selling timber. But this time Athens had recovered sufficiently that they were buying timber in large quantities. So the profit of Macedon went down significantly, and a lot of it's because Amentos is not strong enough to deal with the Olynthians. The threat was that they would use their money to finance a challenger to his throne, and he was pretty vulnerable. And he also has to worry about the Illyrians, who were very strong at the time. He does then make an alliance with Sparta and manages to crush Olynthus in 379. So now there's no more middleman, and he's making more money. So he restores the basic power of Macedon by doing that, and he gets it back to kind of what it had been before Archelaus. He allies at various times with Jason of Pherae in Athens, and eventually he will make a deal with Athens via the famous strategos Timotheus to do direct dealings with them. This does not quite get back to the level of closeness that the Athenians had with Archelaus, however, because Archelaus, I forgot to mention one other thing he did. Late in the Peloponnesian War, not only did he really get back in bed with Athens to make money, but he also even allowed them to build a dockyard up in Macedon to build ships more quickly, since they wouldn't have to move all the timber down to the Piraeus near Athens. So Amentos doesn't get into bed with the Athenians the same way that Archelaus had, but still he's making bank off of them. So Amentos the Third for me is a C. I almost wanted to rank him a little lower, but the thing is he was not in the greatest position, and he didn't do a lot of long-term structural damage. He just undid some gains ultimately. But of course he's coming to power after a short but very violent and confusing period. So I can't be too harsh. I'll give him a C. Next up is Alexander II, the eldest son of Amentos III. He was co-ruler from about 375 or maybe 373. And by the time that he came to power, he would have only been in his early 20s. So he was still a young man, and unlike a more famous Alexander later, he was not quite ready for the role. What happened to him is that he got a little overambitious, and he wanted to reestablish Macedon's hold in Thessaly, which to me is evidence that the Argids had a very clear strategic vision from the time of Archelaus forward, where the path that they wanted to take was very obvious. They wanted to establish dominance over Thessaly first and move on from there. So Alexander II, a man in his early 20s, leads an invasion. It's going okay at first. He's establishing garrisons, but this alarms the Spartans, who at this time are not the Spartans. They're already off the scene in the north, but it alarms the Thebans, who are now in hegemony. This is now the 360s, early 360s. And they're concerned about the balance of power in the north shifting too far and having to deal with another Jason of Pherae-like figure. So the official Theban general of the north, Pelopidas, is dispatched. He goes north and drives the Macedonians out of Thessaly in fairly humiliating fashion. This leads to the questioning of Alexander's fitness and his ability to command, and it leads to a challenge by an Argid relative named Ptolemy, who ultimately is able to overthrow and kill Alexander II. Alexander II, for me, is an E. He had the right idea, he failed, and then he was overthrown and assassinated. I can't quite give him an F because while he did fail, he wasn't necessarily a complete idiot. He just happened to fail. So that, for me, it makes him an E. Now we move on to his kinsman, Ptolemy of Alaris, also known as Ptolemy the First. And by the way, when scholars speculate that the famous Ptolemy, founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, is a relative of Alexander, it's largely based on the fact that this guy is a member of the Argid dynasty. So the idea is that the later Ptolemy must be some relative of this guy, and therefore an Argid of some kind or other. Or maybe just someone who had an in-law who was an Argid, whatever the case might be. So Ptolemy was fairly trusted by Alexander and by his father Amentos. He had been an ambassador to Athens around 375 or so, and this means possibly that when he acted against his cousin, that he did so with Athenian backing. The Athenians at this time were still fairly interested in getting the best terms they could from any given Macedonian ruler, so they were willing to give gold to challengers. It's possible that Ptolemy was working with the Athenians. After Amentos died, Ptolemy began to plot against Alexander II. He took up with Amentos' widow, whose name was Eurydice, and then in 368 he assassinated her son, Alexander II, after the failed campaign, and he seized power. For the Macedonian nobility, this was disgraceful, and it was a betrayal of the memory of the men they were loyal to. And since Amentos III still had 2 living sons who were not quite of age, they felt that the throne was rightfully theirs. They called in the general Pelopidas, who dutifully marched north, and he hammered out a deal with Ptolemy, whereby Ptolemy would not be king, but rather regent, and that Perticus III, the second son of Amentos, would become king when he came of age. Also part of this deal is that the youngest of Amentos' son, the future Philip II, would go to Thebes. He then became a ward of Pelopidas and Epaminondas and learned a lot about warfare, something that would become sort of important later. Anyway, as soon as Ptolemy now served as regent from 368 to 365, Perticus came of age, and not surprisingly, his first act was to kill Ptolemy. So Ptolemy is effectively a failed usurper who brought about a Theban intervention and really made Macedon look unstable. He revealed the fact that you can back any Argid prince and create instability. So this is part of the reason why the Athenians were always confident that they would ultimately manage to take out Philip, because they knew that at some point he would be betrayed, or at least they suspected he would. So for me, Ptolemy has to be at least an E. Maybe an F, even. But he's not really a failed usurper, because he did manage to hang on to power. He's sort of on the E-F borderline. I don't know. It's hard. E or an F. Let me check the chat real fast, see what everybody thinks. Do you want to go E or F with Ptolemy of Alaris? And while we're waiting on some responses, I will go ahead and read this super chat by Diogenes for $5. Thank you, Diogenes. What do you think about Alexander the Great as a cultural icon? I've been reading up on this, but I wanted to see what you knew about Imitatio Alexandri. Alexander absolutely did inspire a lot of culture in the Hellenistic period. There's evidence that statues of Apollo were somewhat redesigned to look more like Alexander, to do the head tilt. A lot of the diadoques began to do the head tilt after Alexander, because they wanted to emphasize their closeness. Alexander appears in the art of all his successors. When Ptolemy writes his memoirs, he focuses very heavily on his closeness with Alexander, and he really emphasizes their friendship, even though he's like 10 years older, and they might not have been that close. But Ptolemy says, we were best friends. And Seleucus, who was fairly junior for most of Alexander's reign, and a few years younger, who didn't really come to be a unit commander till pretty late on, his whole thing is, okay, listen, Alexander and I used to hunt all the time. So all of these successors are very desperate to be as close to Alexander as possible. And actually, I just realized something. The book giveaway is back now. Thank you for the question, Diogenes. It looks like most people are divided on the EF. Yeah, so like I said, he's kind of either an E- or F+ for Ptolemy of Alaris. Book giveaway is back this week. I found some extras, so we will do something relevant to this topic. I have a Loeb edition, actually, for those of you familiar with that. I have an extra one of those, and it is a work that is fairly relevant to the topic tonight. So that will be the book giveaway to the biggest donor. Let me make sure I've got all the existing donations recorded, so that way the biggest donor will win the prize, as is how this usually works. Or the only way it can work and be fair. So let me do that real fast. Okay, so just keep in mind that will be at stake. A Loeb edition. Alright, and those all you know what Loeb is, right? The lobes are, at least the Greek lobes have Greek text on the left, and it's not quite a critical edition of the Greek, but it is still a very good and reliable one. And then you have the English translation on the right. So those are pretty useful for those of you who are serious about studying history. And in the meantime, now that you all know the stakes for tonight, I will return to our regularly scheduled programming. And for those of you who might be new, tier list was not working tonight, so I was forced to rely upon this program here of files. So, File Manager, that's, I guess, what we're using tonight. So after Ptolemy of Alaris is put to death, Perticus III takes power in his own right. He came of age in 365. He, of course, is the younger brother of Alexander, son of Amentos. His first act after killing Ptolemy, well, we actually don't know that much about his reign. He rules until 359. It would appear that he is ambitious, just like his brother was. As I mentioned, his brother had tried to invade Thessaly. Perticus seems to be similarly minded. We don't really know too many details, though, and my suspicion is that there's a good possibility that Philip II deliberately obscured Perticus's deeds because Perticus might have had a few of the same ideas that Philip later implemented. All we do know is that in 360 or 359, Perticus, who was now in his probably mid to late 20s, led a campaign in the north against the Illyrians and became one of many Macedonian kings to die in battle. He then left a young son who was way too young to rule, and this made his 24-year-old brother Philip the regent. The disaster that Perticus suffered resulted in at least 4,000 casualties. This is a figure from Diodorus, who's pretty all over the place when it comes to casualty figures, but that seems like a pretty realistic number given the probable numbers of the armies engaged and the ability of the Illyrians, who are light, to mount a pursuit. So while this is not something that would devastate the Macedonian army, it's still something that would be a significant setback, and you can see why the Macedonians were looking for a strong ruler rather than a child. So ultimately, Perticus' failure did undermine the legitimacy of his son and made people look more to his brother, who's already an adult. Perticus III, for me, is a D. I think he's a little below average, but again, if we had a fuller record of his achievements, I bet that he might have actually started a few of the reforms that Philip gets credit for. But maybe I'm just a little soft on Perticus, I don't know. So this leads to Perticus' son, the boy Amentos the Fourth. Amentos seems to be a rare quantity in this era. He seems like a genuine nice guy who was content leading a quiet life. And as many of you know who followed my series on the successors, that was an age of assholes. Most of these Macedonian nobles and royals are pretty much all assholes. Whatever else you might say about them, these are not pleasant people. These guys are backstabbers, they're prideful, and they really will do anything to gain power. Amentos IV, not so much. So he is born around 365, and he's about 5 or 6 when he becomes king. His uncle Philip becomes his regent, and after about 6 months, Philip is doing really well, and the Macedonian army basically asks him to be king. He says yes. He tells his nephew Amentos, "You're no longer king. Stick with me, and I will make sure that I don't have to kill you." So basically, Amentos IV is kept around as a potential spare. Within a few years, Alexander will be born. So now, Amentos IV is no longer a potential heir, unless something were to happen to Alexander, which, given the rate of childhood death and antiquity, there was a reason to keep Amentos around. So he's basically 9 years older than Alexander. He never really has any designs on the throne. There's no evidence he was ever in cahoots with any foreign power to try to seize the throne. He marries one of Philip's daughters. He marries Her name is Cunani. She is half Illyrian, and he's the father of Adia, who later becomes Eurydice II, the wife of Philip III Aridaeus. So, Amentos the Fourth actually does have a role to play. He has nothing to do with Philip II's eventual assassination, but as part of his gathering of power, Alexander decides to take out his cousin. When he comes to power himself, Alexander is only 20 or so. Amentos the Fourth would have been 29, so he'd have been a little more stable, at least in the eyes of some of the nobles. So when Alexander comes to power with the help of the senior generals, including Antipoder and Parmenion, they decide that a smart move is to kill Amentos IV, lest he should be the focal point for some revolt by some of the less reliable nobles or some foreign power. So Amentos IV is duly executed. I have to give him a U. He didn't really do anything. But again, interesting guy because he seems to have had no ambitions. Maybe his uncle just intimidated him enough that he decided to keep his mouth shut. I don't know. Or maybe he was genuinely nice. I guess we'll never know. But that leads us to Philip II, one of the greatest state builders in all antiquity. I'm not going to go through Philip II in detail for a few reasons. One, I've talked about him many times before. And two, there is a glut of modern scholarship on Philip II. Even in antiquity, after Alexander's conquest, there was still a legitimate debate that they would practice in schools of rhetoric and that they would have in Macedonian camps about who was greater, Philip or Alexander. And given the extent of Alexander's conquest, that's saying a hell of a lot about Philip. Philip completely reformed the army. So the classical pike phalanx that we associate with the Macedonians, that was the invention of Philip, and he based that largely upon experiments that he watched as a kid, conducted by Pelopidas, Epaminondas, and the other great Theban generals of the 370s and 60s. Philip II was a military genius in the sense of being an organizational genius, and also he's an underrated commander. Sort of the, I guess, summary of Philip and Alexander's relationship is that Philip built the army and Alexander used it, but that ignores just how good Philip was with the army. Philip faced fairly open borders on all sides, and he was attacked by all of his neighbors. A lot of his neighbors assumed that they could easily get rid of him by backing one of his rivals. But they didn't. They couldn't. He consistently outfoxed all of them. He was a brilliant diplomat. Philip married a lot of women and gained the allegiance of many of his neighbors. He brought Epirus into the fold. Epirus was an emerging kingdom, and he became a close ally by marrying a woman who later became known as Olympias. She changed her name on a few different occasions. I've talked about that in the past. We'll just call her Olympias, since that's the name that most people are most familiar with. And of course, Olympias became the mother of Alexander. He outfoxed the Athenians on many occasions because they, as a lot of the other powers that had risen in the 4th century, including Thebes, really fell off. Athens sort of started to come back as one of the major players, but they were never strong enough to take on Macedon. They tried to attack Philip in some vulnerable points here and there, but they never quite struck a blow. Philip was always just a step ahead. He slowly gained control over the coast. He also seized and managed to work all the gold mines in the area, so both in Macedon and Thrace. Those became Philip's possessions. He completely conquered Thessaly. He defeated the Illyrians and a lot of his other neighbors. And ultimately, he built his army to the point where he could challenge the Greeks outright. So the Greeks built a coalition around Athens and Thebes and challenged him at the Battle of Cairneus in 338. The Greeks had an advantage in numbers, and the quality of the army that they put forward was actually pretty damn good. But Philip, by this point, had an expert army. He also had his son Alexander, who was of age and commanding the companions. Philip was able to defeat this alliance, and this led to, in many ways, the end of Greek independence, at least the beginning of the end. So Philip then created the League of Corinth. He managed to tap into Greek resentment against the Persians, and he began to recruit a lot of Greeks to go invade Asia. One problem that Philip had, he was never able to resolve because it was impossible, is that a lot of his noblemen, as I mentioned, are assholes. So one of the problems that presented is that anytime you had to resolve a dispute, you were going to leave somebody very pissed off. He recently married a woman named Cleopatra, and he needed her father as a close ally, and he was slated to be a senior general going into Asia. But this man had supposedly sexually abused another young nobleman who complained to Philip and expected justice. When Philip adjudicated, he tried to play the middle, and this kept his new father-in-law happy, but it absolutely aggrieved this young man. So when Philip was attending another wedding ceremony, he was then murdered by this young guy who had been raped by Attalus being the father-in-law. And thus ended Philip's career. Now, of course, there have been all kinds of speculations about how Alexander or Olympias was behind his assassination, because Alexander was becoming concerned that Philip had other sons who might come of age, and he also felt like Philip might gain a lot of glory in Asia that he wouldn't be able to share in because he might be left behind as regent. We don't know exactly what Alexander's role would have been in the campaign. So it's impossible to say if Alexander was involved in this. Most likely not. Most likely this was an example of a Greek nobleman being a Greek nobleman and putting his honor ahead of common sense and the public interest. I mean, also, if you think about it, effectively, love affairs gone wrong accounts for a lot of assassinations in antiquity. This also is why Hipparchus, the brother of Hippias in Athens, was murdered, because Hipparchus made some unwanted advances on a young man, and then that young man and his lover decided that Hipparchus had to pay for really violating their aristocratic pride. And then because those two guys destabilized the dynasty of the Pisistrates, and this ultimately led to the rise of democracy, these two proud, arrogant aristocrats became champions of democracy and got statues, which would probably horrify them if they knew. Because these guys were definitely just snobbish aristocrats who were way more worried about their honor than anything remotely important. Philip's an S, obviously. I mean, Philip, as I said, one of the greatest state builders of antiquity, and you can argue about whether he's greater than Alexander or not. I would say that he's more well-rounded than Alexander, that's for sure. And we're talking about his role as a king of Macedon, and in terms of enhancing the territorial unit of Macedon, Philip II is undoubtedly greater than Alexander. Alright, so that was a hot take for you. And let's now go into Alexander III, also known as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, very obscure figure, of course. Not many of you have heard of him. Just kidding. I think it's safe to say he's one of the best known figures in history, so once again, we will not go through every detail. Give you a little perspective, Philip II only really lost one battle in an open sense, and then you can argue that maybe he lost two others because he was forced to withdraw due to pressure elsewhere. I wouldn't count that against him as a defeat, but whatever. Alexander literally lost no battles. None. As I've mentioned in the past, Alexander the Great has a very good case for being the greatest general to ever live. And if he's not the greatest, he's at least top 5. I mean, that's not even being very generous to him. I mean, he is to generalship what Michael Jordan is to basketball. So, Alexander... Do we even need to talk about Alexander? I mean, we all know fucking Alexander. He conquered the Persian Empire, and then he went farther than any Greek had ever gone. He got deep into India. He conquered Afghanistan. He defeated the Persian army in open battle on 3 or 4 occasions. He defeated the Bactrians. He went to Egypt. He cut the Gordian knot. He avenged his father's death. He also early on defeated the Illyrians and the Thracians. He then went on to crush Thebes and destroy the city. Let's just give Alexander his S and move on. We all know Alexander. If I had to further divide the S's, because we're talking about how great they were for Macedon, I actually thought about giving Alexander an A as kind of a hot take, but I can't do it. I can't bring myself to do it. It's just too ridiculous. The only thing I will hold against Alexander, and why I'd put him a little bit below Philip, is this. Alexander did more for Macedon's reputation than its power, in a sense. Because Macedon's power became dispersed because so many men got divided outside of Macedon to hold down the empire. You can say the same thing for Greece as a whole. A lot of men left Greece in order to resettle in the east. And this, of course, did wonders for Greek culture, and the foundation of Alexandria arguably did a great deal to preserve many Greek texts and traditions that otherwise would have probably been lost. At the same time, demographically, it would take the Greek world a long time to recover from this exodus out of Greece and Macedon into the east. And this is because of Alexander. All that being said, a lot of this is unintended consequences, and it is because Alexander died young and before he had established an adult male heir who could take over directly. Because a lot of the problems that would ultimately result in Macedon being weaker in the years after Alexander than it was during his own time is because of the wars of the successors that kept raging on and on and on for 50 years. Had Alexander lived a little longer for his son to be born, even if his son had not quite made it to being of age by the time Alexander died, at least there would have been a clear heir and a clear line of succession. Alexander could have made his wishes known more clearly. But as it is, he apparently didn't think he was dying. And by the time he discovered this, he just handed his signet ring to Perticus and left him to figure it out. So that was Alexander's one great failure. But to be clear, Alexander was only 32 or 33 years old when he died. And this is a guy who had been leading from the front his whole life, ever since he was about 16 or so, when he first got his first taste of command while his father was away on campaign. So Alexander's not the kind of guy who probably saw death as something that could happen to him, at least not at that stage of his life. But that being said, so if I do give him a less of an S than Philip, it is a bit of a quibble. And had he lived longer, obviously I don't think that would be the case. Next up is Alexander's half-brother, Philip III, who had been known as Aridaeus before he was elevated as Philip III by the army. The Macedonian army at Babylon decided to elevate Philip III, who was developmentally disabled. He was a full-blooded Argid, and then they arranged for him to be married to one of Philip's daughters, the aforementioned Eurydice II. This doesn't happen until a few years later, though. But Philip III was, as someone who's developmentally disabled, we don't know exactly how disabled he was, but we know that he clearly was not able to rule. And he might have been able to do some minor ceremonial functions, but clearly he was not a guy who could actually lead armies or make decisions. So a lot of this ranking will actually be more for his wife and her intrigues. Now it's worth noting that she was a teenager when she marries Philip, so she is herself not all that viable of a contender. She was raised to be sort of an Illyrian woman warrior, though, because her mother was an Illyrian warrior princess. And then her father was Philip II, her half-brother's Alexander, so she definitely takes herself very seriously. And she's a formidable woman. When she and her mother are stopped by Macedonian troops, they kill a few before they're taken captive. Actually, her mother gets killed, and she survives. This helps to really undermine the authority of Regent Perticus, who now looks like a killer of Argids, and this allows Perticus's generals to revolt. But we're not getting into the wars of the successors too much, because different topic for a different day, and I've already covered all that stuff in other videos. So ultimately, Philip III and Alexander IV end up in Macedon under the care of Antipoder and then his successor Polyperchon. When Antipoder dies, he leaves Europe to his successor Polyperchon, right here. And second in command, Antipoder's son Cassandra, right here. These two men will fight each other, and one of the puppets they use is, of course, Philip III, and Adia will very much side with Cassandra, and then Alexander IV's grandmother Olympias will side with Polyperchon. Unfortunately for Adia and Philip III, Cassandra will be away when they're making their play for power, and the army will desert because Olympias is present. She is the mother of Alexander, even though she's not a Macedonian. So normally the Macedonian army is very ethnocentric, and they don't give a shit about anyone who's not full Macedonian. But because Alexander the Great is Alexander the Great, and this is his mom, they're all in awe, so they desert en masse, and Adia and her husband Philip III are left for dead. Ranking this on Adia, I have to give them a D out of respect, just because the ploy that she made in that war was very bold. She appeared in front of the men and tried to get them to desert, and then this caused Olympias to come out and do the same thing, just better. But I actually really admire Eurydice II / Adia. She's one of my favorite figures from this period. I wish we knew more about her. Philip III, of course, was still a potent figure, just because of his full-blooded Argid status. Alexander IV never came of age, of course. He's the son of Alexander by the Bactrian princess Roxanne. He was born after Alexander's death, and his early childhood was a tale of being passed around to the various regents. He ends up in Macedon. He ultimately falls into the hands of Cassandra, and Cassandra, by 309, decides he wants to be king, so he has Alexander IV and his mother put to death. Alexander IV has to be a U because he never got to make a decision, and I believe he was murdered at the age of 14, so no reason to rank him. Now, if we sort of backtrack a bit, let's talk about Antipoder. He was never actually a king, but he was regent in Europe while Alexander was in Asia for 13 years, and then he remained the general in Europe for another 4 years after Alexander's death. So I think it's fair to rank him. He had a pretty big impact on the Kingdom of Macedonia. So Antipoder has a lot of things going for him. He was very good as an organizer. One of Alexander's demands is that Antipoder not only had to hold down the fort with a relatively small army, so half or less of the full Macedonian force, but also had to consistently send batches of new recruits, both in terms of Greek mercenaries and Macedonians, to keep Alexander's army replenished, while Alexander pretty much only sent home guys who were used up or whatever. If he did so. He would send home a lot of gold for the higher mercenaries, but for the most part, what Antipoder was expected to do is hold down all of Greece at half strength. But he's able to do that because he's an excellent diplomat, and he also is someone who is a pretty good general, although he's not the best. He also is a man of wide intellectual interest. He is good friends with Aristotle, who is closely connected to the Macedonian court. Of course, Aristotle tutored Alexander and had a friendship with Philip II. But it seems that Aristotle, among the Macedonians, was closest to Antipoder. They were good friends. They exchanged a lot of letters. And Antipoder also was friends with many other intellectuals in the Greek world. We just don't know a lot of the details, but he was a very intellectually curious man, in addition to his more, I guess what you might call, materialistic interest. He famously managed to deal with the Spartans during their revolt at Megalopolis, and then later during the Lamian War, he was pretty hard-pressed by Leosthenes and the Athenians. He had to be bailed out by Leonidas, who died in action, and then again by Craterus, who ultimately became his son-in-law. He played Craterus off against Perticus. Craterus is killed in battle against Eumenes, and then he marries his daughter Phila to a younger man, Demetrius, who was, of course, the son of the famous Antigonus the One-Eyed, who then becomes his chief general because Antipoder himself was getting pretty old by this point. Antipoder oversees Triparadisus. He realizes that he's too old to go for the whole prize, so he decides to play the legitimacy game, brings back the two monarchs to his realm, and then decides to pass on the realm to Polyperchon, possibly because he knows that Cassandra and Antigonus are not on good terms. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Antipoder, for me, I can't give him an S because his military skills are a little lacking. Or maybe it was just he was too old by that point to be as effective as he once was. But even during Philip's time, when he was in his prime, he was never Philip's go-to general. That would have been Parmenion. Antipoder was kind of the third or fourth general. Actually, Antigonus the One-Eyed in the later years of Philip was kind of took over as the third guy. But now Alexander kind of consigned him to obscurity because he wasn't that interested in him, since he didn't know Antigonus that well. So Antigonus, during Alexander's campaigns, is ruling Cappadocia with a skeleton crew. Is at Paphlagonius, one of those two areas. But anyway, Antigonus gets sidelined. But Antipoder, while he was a competent general, he was never great. So I have to only go with A rather than an S. Antipoder was succeeded by the veteran general Polyperchon, who ultimately accompanied the men who were retiring home to Macedon with Craterus. Of course, Craterus gets killed in action, so Polyperchon is now the senior veteran of the Asian campaign. He's got a lot of purchase among the men who came home, so that's important. He's also got a lot of experience and standing in general. But he does not seem to have been very politically astute. And Cassandra is now in his early 30s. He's not really willing to play second fiddle to Polyperchon after basically being the Prince of Macedon under his father, the regent, for so many years. And Polyperchon is at a disadvantage against Cassandra, both in terms of generalship and diplomacy. We'll talk about Cassandra, but he's a massively underrated figure. And Polyperchon clearly was outmatched by Cassandra, even though on paper, Polyperchon, as this veteran of the Asian campaign, should have been able to really just kick the crap out of this guy who had stayed home, but that was not the case. Polyperchon is struggling in Greece against Cassandra, who had taken the fight there, and Cassandra's backing oligarchies while Polyperchon embraces democracies, but Polyperchon's campaigns don't go well because Cassandra has a better fleet and he's moving around more. Cassandra, by the way, was able to patch things up with Antigonus because Antigonus wanted a less legitimate successor in Macedon who couldn't really fuck with him. And because Cassandra had revolted against the Triparadisus agreement engineered by his own father, he would never fully be legitimate. So Antigonus knew that Cassandra in Macedon was way better for him than Polyperchon. So Polyperchon's losing in Greece. He retreats to Macedon and he decides to shore up his legitimacy. He goes to Olympias for help. Olympias at this time is living in her native Epirus, and basically Polyperchon offers her a share of government and a share of the regency of her son, our grandson, Alexander the Fourth. So the first time that they meet is around 318-ish, I think. So Olympias comes into Macedon, and one of her first moves is to basically take over civil government from Polyperchon. Which isn't great, because even though Polyperchon sucks at politics, he's not a bloodthirsty maniac, and he doesn't have axes to grind. For her part, though, Olympias had hated Antipoder for years, and hated many of the nobility. Polyperchon she probably didn't hate because he was in Asia the whole time, so they had no beef. But she hated a whole lot of nobles in Macedon. So she began to go after her personal enemies and kill them. And this starts to alienate the nobility against Olympias and Polyperchon. Cassandra then visits Adia, Eurydice II, wife of Philip III. They form an alliance, and Cassandra offers to bring his army north and help her if she will revolt. So she does. But then famously, as they do the face-off, Olympias arrives to help Polyperchon, and she is the mother of a guy who's basically a god at this point in the minds of the Macedonians. They defect en masse, and it's over. Polyperchon is now sort of entrenched, and he looks pretty good because the chief bulwark of Cassandra's claim to legitimacy is gone. The chief challenge to Alexander IV, who's clearly thrown in his lot by his grandmother, with Polyperchon. But the problem is, again, Olympias keeps overplaying her hand, and she also is very bad at strategy. Either she or Polyperchon sucks at strategy. So even after they manage to get the bodyguard Aristonomus out of retirement to serve as another general, they're waiting for Cassandra to come back, but they really fuck up their deployment. And Olympias has an army with her at a coastal city. I think it's Pydna, I'm not sure. But anyway, she's at a coastal city, and Cassandra arrives suddenly with a superior force. Olympias's army is not able to match him, so she's forced to retreat into the city, but she wasn't expecting this, so she has no provisions. Aristonomus has an army nearby, I think at Amphipolis. And then Polyperchon has a smaller army that he's trying to build to be a relief army. So basically, what Cassandra's able to do is defeat his enemies in detail. He goes after Aristonomus first, deals with him. He comes back. Olympias and her men are starving. He manages to beat Polyperchon, lay siege, and Polyperchon is ultimately forced to flee. Olympias and Aristonomus surrender. He can't put them to death without losing support, so what he does is he has show trials where the juries are composed of the victims of families who were killed by Olympias. Now, Aristonomus didn't really take part in any of that, but he's still executed anyway, because the victims think that he was siding with the murderer. So Cassandra cleverly deals with them. Polyperchon is now forced to leave Macedon. That's the end of his tenure there. He has some success at entrenching himself in the Peloponnese, although once again he will get outmaneuvered over the years. After Cassandra kills Alexander IV, Antigonus decides to send Heracles, the Persian bastard son of Alexander, as a bargaining chip for Polyperchon. He basically gives Polyperchon control of Heracles and says, go raise hell, and use this man as an instrument. So, of course, Polyperchon decides to do that. He raises 20,000 men in the Peloponnese, marches north. They meet at the border, and Cassandra somehow convinces this moron that he shouldn't fight him and take control of Macedon, but rather take a title, General of the Peloponnese, and some money. In exchange, Polyperchon kills Heracles, his chief bargaining chip, and goes back to the Peloponnese. Then Cassandra contacts Polyperchon's son Alexander, who's becoming discontent with his father's stupidity, and gets Alexander to revolt and take away the chief cities of Polyperchon, which included Sicyon and Corinth. I believe maybe Megara too. So these are some of the major centers that Polyperchon holds, possibly the most important ones. And then Alexander dies not long after that, and he's succeeded by Cratosipolis, his widow. And she also refuses to give these things back to Polyperchon. And she eventually surrenders them over to Cassandra's garrisons and retires. So Polyperchon got outmaneuvered over and over and over by Cassandra. Partly it's because Cassandra, as we'll talk about, is incredibly talented, even though he's been blackened. His name has been blackened by the historical record because he killed a child. But Polyperchon, I want to give him an F, but I'll be generous and give him an E, simply because he was up against an absolute beast. Cassandra, as we'll discuss, massively underrated, and one of the most talented people who tends to get thrown under the bus. So next up is Cassandra. Why is his name blackened, you might ask? Well, it's quite simple. Cassandra is a guy who killed Alexander IV, so he ended the Argid dynasty, which, of course, is something that makes you unpopular with the sources. You're destroying the whole tradition. He also betrayed his father's arrangement, so he's often portrayed as being perfidious, and he was. He was definitely perfidious. He was an untrustworthy man. But there are some stories about him that are probably false. There's one that he couldn't recline in the banquet until the age of 35 because he hadn't yet successfully killed a wild animal on the hunt. And that was something you were expected to do before you could recline like a man. This is probably a made-up story to try to say that he was cowardly and relied upon intrigue like a woman. I don't think there's any reason to believe that story, though. Cassandra, as we'll see, when he was in command of troops in the field, was a very good general, and a lot of generalship at this time was being able to fight in the front ranks and do so at least competently. So there's no reason to believe that Cassandra was some kind of a wimp. His revolt, of course, as we mentioned, worked really well. His support of the oligarchic factions, he played that very well. He used his ships to move around and support his factions brilliantly. He won one major victory with Polyperchon in Attica, where he lured Polyperchon's force in at a time when he allowed a bunch of exiles from the north to come back to Athens. So he created a famine. Polyperchon got caught in it, took some casualties, and lost face. He was then able to establish a puppet government under his supporter, Demetrius of Phaleron, and then go from there to win over some other places. He got caught in a siege at Megara, which then led Polyperchon to be able to crush Adia. So that was Cassandra's one major fuck-up, but he made up for that by coming back after Olympias had thoroughly alienated everyone, won control of Macedon, and now he's facing some strong neighbors. So he's got Lysimicus in Thrace to the north. While he is still embroiled with local problems as a small army, Lysimicus is one of the best generals of the era. You also have Antigonus across the straits. He's pretty juiced this time, and he's not a big fan of Cassandra because early on, when Antigonus was the general of Asia, effectively under Antipoder, leading up to Triparadisus, Cassandra went to be a second in command. And basically, they had a falling out, some sort of conflict of personality within a couple weeks. So Cassandra left the camp. So they really just hated each other for whatever reason. Cassandra, after he came to power, as I mentioned, got rid of his rivals. He then served as regent for Alexander IV for a while until it became inconvenient. In the meantime, he took one of Philip II's other daughters, named Thessalonica, as a bride. Her mother had been a Thessalian noblewoman. By this time, she was already in her early 30s, but she was still fertile. And unlike many marriages in this period, it looks like this couple actually became pretty close. They ended up having a loving marriage despite the fact that this was something that was very political in its origins. They would have 3 sons together, and tragically, of course, those sons would prove, well, one would prove to be sickly, and the other 2 would prove to be pretty perfidious. So, you know, it kind of ended up being a Greek tragedy. And of course, once Cassandra's sons start to die and start to betray one another, the people who are moralists would say, well, this is the gods striking them down for their father's treachery against the Argid house. But what that does obscure is that Cassandra's reign was a smashing success. He faced... I'm not going to go through the details, really, because this is going long, and I have a full video on Cassandra. But let's think about the opposition that he faced between his assumption of power in 316 and then his death in 297. He faces Antigonus the One-Eyed, Antigonus' son Demetrius. He faces Pyrrhus of Epirus. He faces Lysimicus. He faces the Antigona general Aristodemus, who's very good. He faces everybody at this time who was talented. He faces Cleitos the White, that great but megalomaniacal admiral. He only has 2 known subordinates, Nicanor, who tried to betray him and he had to execute, and then Prepolaus, an extremely mediocre but loyal commander. So Cassandra has to be his own best commander. He often faces greater numbers, but he always wins through both military skill, the ability to maintain the loyalty of his troops, which was never given during the successor era, and using diplomacy to create distractions. So Cassandra faces challenge after challenge and always prevails. In the lead up to the battle for Ipsus, he actually is the guy who, along with Lysimachus, shifts the arena of action in Asia, because Demetrius has been trying to invade from the south with a much larger army. But every time they clash, it's indecisive, but Cassandra with the smaller army manages to avoid defeat. And then Lysimachus invades Asia, theater of action moves, and Cassandra sends his army to go join them. Of course, he's on the winning side at Ipsus, but that doesn't really help him. But because he's on good terms with Lysimachus, Lysimachus is more concerned with securing Asia than messing with Macedon. Then 4 years later, of course, Cassandra dies of edema. Cassandra for me is an S. I can't really think of anything he did wrong. And again, we have to consider, like, he was facing pretty much all strong opponents. He wasn't facing any scrubs. Everybody he faced was at least active, skilled. Well, I mean, Polyperchon's an idiot, but everybody else was pretty good. Polyperchon, of course, was the warm-up round, but once he got past that, he was pretty much in the championship round for the rest of his life, and he did great. There's also evidence that Macedon recovered a lot under Cassandra, both demographically and economically. He built 2 new major cities, Cassandria on the site of Patadaya, which was the capital in his time and remained a major city for a while before it kind of fell by the wayside. And more importantly in the long run was the city of Thessalonica, named after his wife. At first this was just a supplemental city, but of course later on it grew in importance. Thessalonica, as you all know, remained important for the Romans. It was important for the Byzantine period especially, where it was sort of the second city of the empire for a long time. And even today is the second city of modern Greece. So Cassandra's legacy is actually way more prominent than a lot of people realize. So yeah, for me, Cassandra is an obvious S. And I guess because of that negative tradition around him, if I had an equivalent of sort of Sean's defense of Nixon, I guess Cassandra would be my Nixon. Because I won't deny that he's kind of an asshole, but all these guys are assholes pretty much, so not that big of a deal. And at least Cassandra was very successful as an asshole. So, there's that. Now let's talk about the rest of the Antipotrids, because pretty much the Antipatrid dynasty, in a lot of ways it pretty much is just Cassandra. I mean, unless you want to count his father, who never really served as king. So, next up we have Philip IV, the eldest son of Cassandra and his wife Thessalonica. He survived his father by a few months, became king, and then died of the same disease, edema. Had he lived longer, peace might have broken out. His younger brothers might have remained loyal, but they didn't. And it looks like they started plotting as soon as they realized that their brother was terminally ill. So before 297 was out, Philip IV would join his father in the ground. And this leads to a civil war between the middle brother, Antipoder II, and the youngest brother, Alexander V. We'll talk about Antipoder II first, although it doesn't really matter because they kind of meet a similar end. So Antipoder II is desperate to take full power, even though the arrangement was for the two brothers to divide power. So he starts out by murdering his mom, Thessalonica. And then he goes after his brother, so his brother flees and asks for aid from both Pyrrhus of Epirus and Demetrius the Besieger. Demetrius was a bit homeless at the time, but he did have a large army. Pyrrhus, of course, was king of Epirus and a nearby neighbor with known ambitions. So he brought in 2 hungry lions. And both these guys at the time were still ostensibly allies, so that if they came in together, they'd be looking to divide things together. So Alexander V made a huge mistake in inviting these 2 guys in. But Antipoder II put him in a bad position. He killed their mom. What else was he going to do? Just leave and let the kingdom go to his brother, who was a matricide? So, impossible position. But clearly a bad decision for the Antipatrid dynasty. So, Antipoder II is sitting on the sidelines. They make a deal with Pyrrhus where they give him part of their kingdom to go away and then sort of return to sharing power, but now with the western part of their kingdom gone. And then Demetrius shows up late. He says, "Hey, I'm here. Let's fight a civil war." And he arrives and meets with Alexander, who says, "Hey, dude, thanks for coming, but we figured it out already with Pyrrhus, and you can go now." Demetrius says, "I'm not leaving without getting something for my troubles." So Alexander says, "Let's do a banquet." And then he tries and fails to assassinate Demetrius. Demetrius, of course, is rightfully furious. And then they have a reconciliation. And Demetrius invites Alexander to a banquet. And Alexander is convinced that Demetrius is being sincere this time. And he's about to leave. So he attends a banquet, and Demetrius famously walks by a guard and says, "A man is about to come behind me, kill him." That man, of course, was Alexander V of Macedon. the youngest son of Cassandra. He gets murdered at the banquet, so Demetrius declares himself king, seizes Alexander's share, and then marches on Antipoder, who is forced to flee to the court of Lysimicus. Basically what happens is that Demetrius is going to use the momentum to invade Lysimachus' territories, but some other shit happens, so he can't. And then they enter into negotiation, and in exchange for Demetrius renouncing his claim to his father's old holdings in Asia, they're now held by Lysimachus. Lysimachus agrees to kill Antipoder. So there you go. All of Cassandra's sons are now dead, and there's only one Antipoder left, who we'll revisit in a minute. If he made it, let's see. Did he make it? He did, but he came out of order. Anyway, he only comes about in 279, so we'll get to him when we get to him. Now it's the year 294. Demetrius is in command. So, Demetrius is one of the most famous men of the successor period. He's the son of the one-eyed Antigonus. So he is a powerful monarch in his own right. He is an accomplished general in many ways, but he is strategically incompetent, even if he is tactically fairly good. He's got a lot of charisma. He also parties hard. He famously set up shop in the Parthenon with his prostitutes and partied. He thought the Athenians liked him more than they did because they were desperate to get money from him, so they were willing to lavish all kinds of honors upon him in exchange for his support. So he restored democracy, but still lived kind of like a god up on the Acropolis. Very weird arrangement. And of course, later on, when his power was weakened, the Athenians would basically tell him to go fuck himself. So, you know, they weren't very sincere when they were giving him honors. They just wanted the money and the support. So, yeah, there's that. Demetrius had been involved in Greek politics for a long time, as his father's representative in general. As I mentioned, he had tried to invade while Cassandra was defending the south at one point. And during about this time, Demetrius also was engaged in the first known booty call in history. So around 307 or 6, Cratesipolis had retired to an estate in southern Greece after she had given her possessions away to Cassandra, and she began to exchange letters with Demetrius. So Cratesipolis was famous for being a beautiful woman. And Demetrius was also known for being a looker. He was a very tall, handsome guy, and at this time he's still very young and in his prime. So both of them have heard rumors that the other is pretty attractive. So they start exchanging letters. And they're curious about one another because they're both sort of young, attractive rulers. And they arrange to do a booty call in a tent outside of a city. So while he has a siege going on, Demetrius decides to leave one of his generals in charge, and he goes off on what he calls a scouting expedition, and he's going to meet Cratesipolis, and they're going to bump uglies. Well, either Cratesipolis was working for Cassandra the whole time, which I think is probably what was happening, or else she was being monitored, and some of Cassandra's agents found out about it, because Demetrius shows up in this tent, takes off his clothes, and he's ready to get it on. And then some guys come out of hiding with daggers, and he has to run. And he has to run nude and escape. So to the best of my knowledge, I don't think he ever scored with Cratesipolis. But as I mentioned, he got laid a lot in Athens and the Acropolis, especially in the Parthenon itself. So he made up for it. But yes, Demetrius did escape nude once, which I think is one of his cooler accomplishments. His nickname, Polyarchides, the Besieger, came from his use of siege equipment. He also was fond of building unnecessarily large ships. He had a thing called the City Taker, which was a massive siege engine, which sometimes got bogged down at key moments, but sometimes was brilliantly successful. Anyway, in 294, he's now king of Macedon. He is still trying to avenge his father's overthrow, because at one point Antigonus was the most powerful successor. He controlled the bulk of Alexander's empire, but now Demetrius is kind of homeless until he takes over Macedon. One thing he does succeed in doing is ousting Pyrrhus from western Macedon, but otherwise he's basically ineffective as king. One what he effectively does is his idea of kingship is that the Macedonian army can't be trusted, so they have to be kept busy at all times. So he makes a lot of wars. And the problem with that, of course, is that this means lots of conscription and taxation. And his wars don't really gain that much for Macedon, so people start to get a little pissy. So Demetrius also is not very good at the parts of kingship that people like Philip II and Cassandra understood. He's not good at showing concern for people. So one of the king's duties was to receive petitioners. Demetrius was an arrogant bastard. When he received petitions, rather than reading them and trying to relate to people in the Macedonian tradition, where the kings were supposed to be sort of humble men who were accessible, Demetrius said, the common people don't matter, fuck them, took their petitions and threw them in the river. And he did this for a long time, until some old woman said, Demetrius, if you don't have time to listen to your people's concerns, you don't have time to be king. So then he overreacted, and he started doing nothing but petitions for like a week straight. Dawn to dusk. But then he probably lost interest in that and went back to, partying and making wars. And also, he could be obsessive in operations and lose sight of the grand strategy. At one point, he's trying to seize control of the city of Thebes, which had actually been rebuilt by Cassandra, by the way. And he was so obsessed with recreating a deed of Alexander that he kept launching assault after assault. His son tried to urge him to calm down and just do a normal siege. But Demetrius insisted upon doing assaults, so got a lot of men killed. Nearly got himself killed. He got wounded through the neck by a javelin. He did take the city, but it cost a lot of men. And later in his reign, as we get towards 288, he begins to really develop a grandiose plan to reclaim all of his father's holdings in the east. So all of Asia Minor and then the eastern parts of Alexander's realm. He raises a massive army, supposedly of 98,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry with 500 ships. So this requires a huge levy of Macedonian manpower and hiring a lot of mercenaries. So raising massive amounts of money and denuding the countryside of men. Needless to say, not popular. So Demetrius has heard rumblings and complaints about himself, and he knows that many of the men now really look up to Lysimicus, who has been this dutiful king who has been carving out a Macedonian presence in Thrace for years, languishing in obscurity, but engaged in militarily impressive feats and really kicking ass, being a good king. So Demetrius is worried that if he confronts Lysimachus directly, a lot of his men will defect. So what he does is he decides to go south to fight Pyrrhus first, because Pyrrhus is also invading. And to his shock and dismay, a lot of his men actually defect to Pyrrhus when they're facing off. So Demetrius decides, okay, that's terrible. I didn't realize Pyrrhus was this popular, must be bribing them. So then he shoots north and tries to face Lysimachus. His idea is a need to fight this battle before my men have a chance to defect. Well, his men defect anyway. So now his army's been reduced massively, by half or more. So rather than sticking around, he flees from Macedon altogether. It's now divided between Lysimachus and Ptolemy. Pyrrhus. And so he takes his ships and goes into Asia, invades the realm of Lysimachus there. He does have some popularity in the region, so it's not as stupid of a move as a lot of people make it out to be. He leaves his son Antigonus II in command of a few random garrisons in the Greek world, while he is gallivanting around with the main force in Asia. Brilliantly, Lysimachus' son, Agathocles, decides not to fight Demetrius directly because that gives him a puncher's chance. So Demetrius' army is being lured east without being offered a decisive battle, and basically Agathocles is just denying battle, holding all the cities. Ultimately, as Demetrius' force continues to starve and shrink, he crosses the Taurus Mountains into Seleucus' realm, and Seleucus does the same thing, and ultimately compels Demetrius' survivors to surrender. Demetrius then becomes a prisoner of war, and Seleucus sets him up in a grand park. Lysimachus actually sends money to try to get Seleucus to kill Demetrius, but Seleucus realizes that Demetrius is a valuable hostage. However, after just 2 years in captivity, Demetrius goes from hunting every day like just a guy who was super active to being a guy who just ate and drank all day and ultimately died after 2 years of overindulgence. So he dies in 282, and the Antigonid family is broke because his son and successor Antigonus II has to pay a lot of money to get his father's remains back, and he tried to pay a big ransom to Seleucus, but Seleucus didn't want to give him up. So basically, Demetrius recovered the family fortunes and then bungled it massively. Demetrius is basically the biggest gambler here. I know Pyrrhus has a reputation for being a gambler, but by comparison with his former brother-in-law Demetrius, not even in the same ballpark. I mean, Demetrius is the kind of guy who would go to a casino, win a bunch of money, and not stop until he lost every penny. Fascinating figure, but if I were rating him just as a successor, I might be willing to give him a higher rating. But because his people literally abandoned him and came to hate him, and because he was a notoriously bad ruler, I have to give him an F. I mean, Demetrius, for being as famous as he was a horrible king. He was much better as the son of a king who was a right-hand man. But as a king himself, abysmal. And part of that's because he grew up in the East, where kings were more ostentatious and distant. But in Macedon, kings like Philip and even Cassandra, and also the later Antigonid rulers, would all be men who did not put themselves up on a pedestal ceremonially. They would go by their first names. People could come up to them and talk like they were talking to human beings. There wasn't a lot of bowing and scraping and all that kind of stuff, so not a lot of ceremony. And Demetrius never understood that about the Macedonians and managed to alienate them thoroughly. So he's an F. Next up is Lysimicus. Lysimicus, of course, is the ruler who ruled up north. I also have a long video on him from the Successors series. Lysimicus, in my opinion, is the most underrated of all the successors because he tends to get overlooked because he spends a lot of the time in Thrace with a small army, languishing in obscurity, but he does manage to derail the plans of many of his more powerful neighbors on several occasions. He derails Antigonus the One-Eyed on a couple of occasions, and was the commander at the famous Battle of Ipsus, where Antigonus's dreams came to an abrupt end. Lysimachus also was the chief person who managed to screw over Demetrius, of course, as I mentioned. At one point, he was known as the greatest general of the successors, although we don't really have too many examples of his great victories, but the Thracians were notoriously difficult opponents, and Lysimachus's army was pretty small. He comes across as a fairly caustic, reserved, but witty man. A historian arrived to talk about Alexander's campaigns, all of which Lysimachus was present for, and described a lot of wonders in the East, such as Amazon women. And Lysimachus asked him dryly, "Oh, that's interesting. Where was I during that?" So, to me, Lysimachus, personality-wise, has always sort of struck me as kind of a Stannis Baratheon type. A guy who's fairly smart and witty, but not necessarily the most pleasant guy. Can be a bit severe, but ultimately very competent. In 288, when he divided the realm of Macedon with Pyrrhus, this was a truce. Ultimately, what he did was bribe a lot of the Macedonian nobles in Pyrrhus's half to betray him, and all he had to do was remind them of something very basic. Pyrrhus was not Macedonian. And again, never underrate the power of ethnocentricity in this particular period. The Macedonians might be willing to go for a non-Macedonian for a minute, but over time, the idea of being ruled by an outsider will rankle, and they will be willing to revolt. So Pyrrhus didn't really do anything wrong, but he got ousted after 4 years, and the area just kind of went to Lysimachus automatically. So, in 284, Lysimachus really reaches his peak, but by this point, he's a pretty old man, and he has been campaigning very hard in Thrace under hostile conditions for years. He's in his 70s. He has an adult son who's very capable, who's probably in his late 30s or so. His name's Agathocles, I mentioned him earlier. Agathocles is extraordinarily competent. He dealt with Demetrius and would be an excellent successor. But Lysimachus had taken a younger wife. And she now had children. They were not of age yet, but I think one of her sons was a teenager. And she convinced Lysimachus that the way to go... And by the way, this woman's name is Arsinoe. She is a sister of... or one of the daughters of Ptolemy. We'll get into the Ptolemaic family in a minute, since they play a huge role in Macedon's history, actually. She convinces her new husband that he needs to replace Agathocles. It's also possible that Agathocles was plotting a revolt of some kind. Anyway, in 282, as actually tensions are mounting between Seleucus and Lysimachus, as the two of them are about to square off, Lysimachus kills Agathocles, who is, again, his son and successor, but also his best general. And it would appear that Lysimachus, even though he wasn't much older than Seleucus, had aged a lot worse. So in the next campaign, where they clash at Corupedium in Western Asia Minor, by all accounts, basically what happened is Lysimachus sat pat and waited for Seleucus to arrive, and then got crushed. And of course that means he loses control of Macedon, and that's all she wrote. There's been a lot of speculation on whether he became a mad king in his last few years, whether he was senile, or whether he was just a broken old man. It's also possible that he was only broken because he lost his son. Maybe his son did revolt against him through betrayal. I don't know. At any rate, though, Lysimachus did unite Macedon. I have to give him credit for doing it largely peacefully. Lysimachus is difficult to rate, because the way he dies is kind of dumb, actually, but the way he came to power is brilliant. Just based on him as a king of Macedon, because he comes to power peacefully, and no one dies, and then unites his half of Macedon with the other half peacefully again, I'll give him a B. I mean, that's a pretty notable achievement, not common at all. So, but he only rules for a few years and doesn't really change all that much. This leads us to Pyrrhus of Epirus next. Pyrrhus famously is a cousin of Alexander, so he actually looks the most like Alexander naturally, because Alexander actually took a little bit more after his mother's family physically. So he used that to his advantage, even though the two men never met, and actually Pyrrhus, I don't believe, was born until right after Alexander died. He definitely played up his looks, and that's part of why Macedonians were sometimes intrigued by him. Pyrrhus was an excellent warrior. He grew up in the Macedonian court, or the Epirote court of the time when Epirus was deeply divided, and when there's lots of infighting at court. He had to fight brothers and cousins for control. As a teenager, by the time he's 16 or 17, he's forced to leave, and then he goes to the court of the Antigonids, where he befriends Demetrius. He arranges for Demetrius to marry his sister Didamia, and they actually become kindred spirits, because actually Demetrius and Pyrrhus, personality-wise, have some similarities. The difference is that while Demetrius loves to party and can be a little flippant at times, Pyrrhus is deadly serious, has basically no sense of humor, and no interest outside of military stuff. So Pyrrhus is kind of like Frederick William of Prussia, in that the only topics he's willing to discuss all involve military stuff. If you tried to ask him who are the greatest poets of Greece, he'd say, I don't know, let's talk about the greatest generals of Greece. I mean, that's how he worked. He was an obsessive guy, and as a personal warrior, he was deeply impressive. He might have been the best one-on-one fighter of his era. As a 17-year-old fighting at the Battle of Ipsus, he really impressed both the elderly Antigonus, the one-eyed, and Demetrius. And somebody supposedly asked Antigonus who would prevail in the end, and he said, Pyrrhus, if he lives long enough. During the Battle at Ipsus, supposedly Pyrrhus took down about 20 guys by himself. And for the rest of his life, the next 30 or so years, Pyrrhus would be known as a guy who was basically unbeatable in one-on-one battle and would sort of cut a swath by himself. So he was a guy who was not to be fucked with. That being said, Pyrrhus was held back by the fact that he's from a small kingdom. Epirus did not have the manpower pool or urban development to host large armies. His goal was to succeed his distant cousin Alexander, I think actually second cousin, as king of Macedon, a dream that he achieved a couple times but never for long. Pyrrhus, of course, now is mostly known for his Pyrrhic victories against the Romans. However, that was only in a period between his attempts to gain control of Macedon. Because Pyrrhus, his dream, as I mentioned, was to be the king of Macedon. And he temporarily gave up on that to go to Italy and Sicily, where he discovered, yeah, there's also problems here, and I still don't have a deep enough manpower pool to deal with these damn Romans. We, of course, won't talk about his western campaigns, which are irrelevant here. Suffice to say that his first run was when he divided Macedon with Lysimicus. By this point, his sister Didamia had died, and he and Demetrius had become enemies. So he and Demetrius had clashed on many occasions, even before the division. At one time, they went to war with one another while Demetrius was claiming Western Macedon. And what happened is that Demetrius was trying to invade Epirus while Pyrrhus was trying to intercept him. They ended up passing each other somehow without coming in contact. So Demetrius was then able to occupy Western Macedon and secure it without a fight. But Pyrrhus was then able to penetrate behind Demetrius' lines and came across one of Demetrius' generals who was trying to invade Aetolia, which was now one of the allies of Pyrrhus. And Pyrrhus kicked the shit out of General Perticus, and did so well in the battle that many of the Macedonians said, there's a real king. This guy is a beast. We should follow a guy like that. And according to my dad, that's what Alexander looked like. We need another Alexander. You know, Pyrrhus, there's a man. So, basically, that's when people started to realize that Pyrrhus might be a cool king. So in 288, when they do the pincer between Pyrrhus and Lysimicus, this is why Demetrius doesn't understand why his men are deserting, because a lot of guys had seen Pyrrhus in action and thought, that guy's kind of cool. So Pyrrhus will now hold Western Macedon once again, a bigger portion of it this time, for 4 years, but his reign is being quietly undermined by letters from Lysimachus, trying to smear him and smear his Epirot heritage. So his nobles revolt, and basically Pyrrhus is forced to beat a retreat pretty ignominiously. Then he gets invited to invade Italy. From Italy, he then has an opportunity to either come back and try for Macedon again, or to go to Sicily. He opts to go to Sicily instead, does Italy one more time, and then retreats home to Epirus with a fairly small army. But to give you a sense of the scale of Epirus, even though his army that he brings home after his last Pyrrhic battle is only 8,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, he still can't afford to pay it. So rather than disband his army, he immediately goes to war and decides to invade Macedon. But this time it's 474. The king is Antigonus II, who we haven't gotten to yet. And Antigonus, at this point, has not really proven himself as a warrior, and he also failed to hire all the various Galatians who had invaded. So Pyrrhus hires a few more of them. They go on a plundering expedition. This is originally just to make money to pay his troops, but then it evolves into, well, actually, Antigonus II is a bad general. Let's just conquer Macedon. So Pyrrhus, being the opportunist that he is, overruns Macedon. The army comes over to him because Antigonus is a poor general who's not very inspiring. And, yeah, Pyrrhus just takes over. So now he's in charge again. But because of previous experience, he realizes that he really needs to burnish his resume to gain legitimacy and hold it. He's worried about Antigonus II, but he can't quite get to him because he is ensconced in a few garrisons and has a fleet. A small one, but still. So Pyrrhus decides to go after some of Antigonus' allies, and he decides that one glorious thing he can do is go after Sparta. So he goes to Sparta, and he fights a pretty desperate battle there. It's well recorded in Plutarch, and I believe Diodorus talks about it as well. Desperate, bloody fight, and he's on the verge of possibly winning. Antigonus does send some mercenaries to help out. Then he gets invited to intercede in a civil war in Argos, so he goes there. Just like his former brother-in-law, he has strategic ADD, so he goes to Argos. Once again, bloody street fighting, But this time, he is murdered by someone on the roof of the tile. It's most likely in all the battles he fought hand-to-hand with men who were top-notch warriors. Most likely, the thing that killed Pyrrhus was a roof tile that was taken up and hurled by a woman taking refuge on a roof. Apparently, it landed on his neck, broke it a little bit, so Pyrrhus was disabled, and then one of the men hiding in the houses dragged him in and stabbed him with a dagger, cut his head off, and that was the end of Pyrrhus. His sons, one of them would invade Macedon at a later date, around 260, Alexander II of Epirus, but he failed. He was defeated by Demetrius II. Anyway, as king of Macedon, Pyrrhus to me is the ultimate example of a C, maybe even a D. I mean, he's just not that impressive, really. I mean, he's not terrible, but a lot of it's not his fault because he's an epirote, so he can never really have legitimacy. He also has strategic ADD, as I mentioned. He can't really stay focused. And he got himself involved in a campaign deep in the Peloponnese when he really needed to be worried about Antigonus II. I had to go with the C. I don't know exactly what he should have done to really secure himself or to win legitimacy, but getting involved in 2 bloody assaults is really stupid, especially when you remember what happened to Demetrius I, who got a lot of men killed in action and who ran expensive wars. That was just 20 years before, and you yourself were one of the guys who took advantage of that to stir up discontent and get people to defect to you. Actually, no, I'm bumping Pyrrhus down. As a king, he's only a D. He's a good general, but he's not that good of a king. So he's a D. Then we have Ptolemy Cairneus. He was not a Charon. Cairneus means thunderbolt in Greek. And Cairneus... Wait, wrong thing. Hold on. Cairneus means thunderbolt because of his sort of mercurial personality. He was the eldest son and ostensible successor of Ptolemy the First, Soter, the famous Ptolemy who founded House of Ptolemy. He was the son of Eurydice, the first wife, and by the time that Ptolemy the First decided to retire around 285, Ptolemy Cairneus was already a proven general. He had won a number of battles, and he was 40 to 45 years old, so he was pretty well established. But he also had some notable flaws. Cairneus came because of that mercurial personality. He had a bad temper, and he was known to be a bit of a wild card when it came to what he would do. So Ptolemy ultimately decided to opt for a son by a second marriage, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, because even though this Ptolemy was only about 25 or 26, he was much more cautious and a much better diplomat. So even though he wasn't as good of a general, the old Ptolemy thought that he was better balanced and a better leader. Ptolemy Cairneus does not take this well, so he decides to leave and go into exile. He goes to the court of Lysimicus. When the problems between Lysimachus and Agathocles blow up, he sides with Agathocles. So he then is forced to flee once again. He goes to Seleucus' court because Seleucus is about to invade Lysimachus. And now one of the causes of Seleucus' cause, at least in theory, is avenging Agathocles. So Ptolemy Cairneus is a big part of that. And surprisingly, even though Seleucus is not known to have been a mercurial person, he actually comes to trust and like Ptolemy Cairneus. Maybe he feels that, because he knew Ptolemy pretty well. Maybe he thought Ptolemy was a bit of a slippery guy and that he had screwed over his son, so maybe he felt some empathy for Cairneus. Or maybe he realized that in the end he needed to fight for Ptolemaic Egypt, and Ptolemy Cairneus would be a useful tool. So Seleucus befriends Ptolemy and actually sort of takes him on as a tent mate almost. I mean, they become pretty close. After the Battle of Corupedium, Seleucus takes an advance guard and he's going to secure Macedon and Greece, and among the men he takes with him is none other than Ptolemy Cairneus. One other key fact about Ptolemy that I forgot to mention a second ago is that his mother Eurydice is a daughter of none other than Antipoder. So, this means that not only is Ptolemy Cairneus a Ptolemy, but also an Antipatrid. If you'll recall, Cassandra was one of the greatest kings of recent memory, and he had been an Antipatrid, so there was still some love for that dynasty left over. So, as they're advancing in the Macedon, maybe they're still in Thrace, it's not entirely clear, Seleucus decides that he wants to leave the army for a minute to go on a bit of a joyride. I mean, even though Seleucus at this point is pushing 80, still in great health, still very physically active, and he invites his friend Ptolemy to go along with him. He's like, hey, let's go on a quick joyride real fast while the men are getting together. You know, we'll have a nice, pleasant conversation and come back. So they go off on a little bit of a joyride, and during that time, Ptolemy Cairneus has one of his thunderbolt moments of impetuosity, pulls out a dagger, and kills the old man. And then, because he is both an Antipatrid and a Ptolemy, he goes back to the men and says, I am king of Macedon now. And the men surprisingly say, cool, yeah, you're king of Macedon. So he secures control of this army. Just like that. And now he will rule for 2 years from 281 to 279. He is a very ruthless man, and he secures power pretty rapidly. One of his first moves is to officially renounce his claim to the Egyptian throne and in return for Ptolemy II's support in the event of a very likely response from Seleucus' son and successor Antiochus the First. Of course, that response never fully comes, partly because Antiochus the First also faces revolts in the areas that his father had just conquered and gets bogged down in Asia Minor, so the reckoning for Ptolemy Cairneus never arrives. But Cairneus will then go and marry Arsinoe, who had been the bride of Agathocles, the bride of Lysimicus. Yes, she had been Lysimachus's widow and his own half-sister, because her mother was Bernice, the same mother as Ptolemy II, and by marrying Arsinoe, that was also a signal to his half-brother that they were friends now. But apparently this was more about making good with his brother in Egypt than it was about making good with his half-sister / new wife, because Arsinoe wasn't happy, and while Cairneus was off on campaign once, she revolted and declared one of her young children to be the new king. So one of Lysimachus' sons was now declared king. Cairneus had to come back, and he put her sons to death. So she fled to Egypt, where she then married her full brother, Ptolemy II. Which I believe is the beginning of the brother-sister marriage tradition that the Ptolemies ultimately borrowed from the Egyptians before them. So anyway, Arsinoe got around and married a lot of relatives. But that's not the point. So anyway, Cairneus is now king. He has established himself, and he was spared the Antiochus invasion because of events beyond either their control. And then there's a huge invasion by a Celtic tribe called the Galatians. Famously, of course, they would later settle in the middle of Asia Minor and lend their name to a region, but for now they're invading the Balkans and they've entered into Macedon. This is the first major invasion of an outside tribal force since the time of Alexander the Great, who had done a great job of cowing such people. Cairneus dutifully goes out as king of Macedon to meet them, and then dies in battle. And this leads to some chaos. Just like a thunderbolt, his reign was brief, interesting, and ultimately not all that successful. Ptolemy Cairneus, I'd give him about a D, maybe a C. Obviously, a lot of people tend to denounce him because I know, at least, especially in this audience, there are a whole lot of Seleucus fans. But as with Cassandra murdering Alexander the Fourth, I would ask you to suspend judgment and just focus on how Ptolemy did as a ruler, rather than how he did as a decent human. So, I would say a C or a D is fair. a lot of dying in battle in this period comes down to luck, because when you fight in the front lines, there's always a decent chance that you will take a fatal wound. And if you don't fight sufficiently well in the front lines, your men won't take you seriously. So it's a risk you pretty much have to run. Cairneus is C or a D. He has a brother who I believe is also a son of Ptolemy and Eurydice, named Meleager. Meleager is very obscure right up until his brother dies. He then seizes power for a couple of months. And he actually had a 2-month reign. Then his men mutinied and demanded that he leave. So he did. He's an F. By definition. I mean, if your men won't follow you and they tell you to go fuck off, you're an F. Pretty simple. That led to the restoration of the last ever Antipatrid, Antipoder Atesius. He was a son of the ill-fated Philip IV, therefore a grandson of Cassandra and a great-grandson of Antipoder the First. He seized power in 279 after Meleager, so Meleager was gone, and the army opted for this full Antipatrid. But his reign lasted for a glorious 45 days. His nickname Atesius is because the Etesian wind blew during this time, and that was the only real event that happened outside of politics. The problem for him is that, much like Meleager, the Macedonian army was deeply indifferent to him, and he had no standing, so ultimately he ended up being deposed in favor of a general named Sosthenes. He then tried to retreat to some loyal areas, but by this point Antigonus II is trying to come back, and so drives him out of those areas. He actually escapes to Egypt and takes refuge at the court of Ptolemy II. He's still alive 20 years later when Ptolemy III actually considers sending him back to Macedon to try to challenge the Antagonids, but that never comes to pass, and presumably Antipoder Atesius lives out the last of his days in Egypt in exile. He's an F. The Etesian winds are cool, but the king that they brought, take him or leave him. He's an F. As for Sosthenes, he officially is not a king, although the army offered him the position. What he did instead is he declared himself to be strategos, or general. So he can be represented by one of these, I suppose. So Sosthenes had no royal connections. He decided that one way to keep the Macedonian army happy would be to not pretend to be a king, since he didn't have the bona fides. He will control Macedon from 279 to 276. At this point, 279 is pretty well advanced, so it's really only about 2 years rather than 3. He defeats one Galatian invasion during this time, and he also repels a full-blown invasion by Antigonus II in 378. But then he gets overwhelmed by another Galatian invasion led by Brennus. So ultimately, he will die in action. And despite the fact he's a usurper and he doesn't really have a ton of standing, he clearly had the skill to be a king, because he defended the Macedonian realm pretty ably and then died in battle like a good king would. I'd actually give him a C. He seemed like a guy who, if he had been lucky enough to have a longer reign, would have really established himself and people would have asked him to found a new dynasty. And because he's clearly a better military commander than Antigonus II, I believe that in a rivalry between the two of them, he would have won out. Antigonus II also had to operate against the prejudice that Macedonians felt toward his father, who had been a terrible king. So that was a major millstone around Antigonus II's neck. Speaking of which, Antigonus II is up next. So Antigonus II, Gonatas. When we get, now that we're on the final kings, Antigonus, Demetrius, Antigonus, Philip V, Perseus, I won't go through their biographies in full simply because I do plan to cover the Antigonids, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies in greater detail later. so I'm not going to go through them in exhaustive detail here. So no reason to do that, and it's running late, and I'm sure just like me, all of you are getting tired. So, Antigonus II Gonatas, he actually began to do functions for his father and grandfather during Antigonus the First's lifetime. He was of age, and he was governing Athens at the time of the Battle of Ipsus in 301. He was always someone who had a more philosophical temperament than his father or grandfather. He was never much of a soldier, and actually a pretty poor general. I can't think of any instances where Antigonus II won a battle. So he's a guy who's always dependent upon his generals, but he does seem to be a competent strategist on the grand scale, and he's a pretty good administrator. He also is the first monarch to embrace Stoicism. So his idea was to take the philosophy of the philosopher Zeno, who had taught from the Stoa, hence Stoicism. And one of the things that Zeno had taught, two important factors. One, brotherhood of man. So it does away with the particularism of the earlier philosophical schools which focused on the polis, because Antigonus II wanted to rule a realm where you could have a loyalty to a higher power, i.e. a king, rather than to a local political unit. So that's important. And two, part of Zeno's teaching, because Zeno had been a slave early on in life, was that one should be content with one's station in life, i.e. one should just obey the king. So if you're Antigonus II, those two things are super important. He wants people to obey him and to look to him as someone who gives them their sense of identity rather than being more local and wanting independence. So this is clearly an intelligent guy who understands the value of propaganda. But again, his Achilles' heels are one, his father is an idiot, and two, he's a bad general. So Antigonus II, when he really starts to court elderly Zeno, one other thing about him is that he is a true Macedonian, in the sense that Antigonus II does like the party, not quite like his dad, but he does like to have a good drinking party and be sociable. And he was trying to drag this elderly philosopher along with him. So there's a story, and I believe it's, is it Philostratus? It's one of the people who writes a biography of different philosophers. And the story goes that you got a young Antigonus taking his elderly philosopher friend Zeno with him. He's like, dude, we got to go to this drinking party. This is going to be great. So they're in Athens, and you got like a 20-something-year-old Antigonus II trying to drag along, a guy in his 60s, maybe 70 years old, to a drinking party. And then Zeno quietly slips away. He's like, I don't want to do this. I'm old. Anyway, I found that funny. But Antigonus II, probably better known for his philosophy than anything else. And I think that because a lot of historians now tend to like intellectuals, they tend to see them as sort of fellow kindred spirits, they tend to overrate some of these guys. Antigonus II, his one true quality, if you had to give him a quality, would be grit. As I mentioned, he came into power on a couple different occasions. He ruled between 277 and 74, so he came to power after the disaster of Cairneus, and then Meleager and Antipoder Etesius. And then he comes to power again after Pyrrhus dies in 272. This time he stays until his death in 239. And he does something else impressive. He dies as an old man peacefully. One thing that holds him back in terms of success is not only, again, he has to overcome the prejudice against his dad, and he has to deal with the fact that he's a bad general. The other thing that holds him back is that he has a great rival who emerges in the south. So basically, by the time he comes to power in 272, the successor period is effectively over. There won't be any more grand invasions from, say, Antiochus or anything like that. There might be some meddling from the Seleucids or the Ptolemies, but there's not going to be anybody trying to really do something grandiose, such as uniting Alexander's empire. But now, a new political factor emerges, the Achaean League. So, there's already the Aetolian League, a group of sort of northern Greeks who banded together copied some Macedonian ways of war, banded together the resources to create a stronger army and a federal system. The Achaeans do the same thing more to the south. And they also produce a great leader, Aratus of Sicyon. And Aratus is both a great politician and a pretty solid general. So basically what happens is that while Antigonus wants to play balance of power politics against his two great rivals, they are a little too sharp for him to be able to really take advantage of them. So the gains that he makes are pretty modest, even though he is the greater power, and Aratus is able to offset them, and also the Aetolians are sort of at the height of their power, so they're not caving in easily. So he does establish the three-way dance between the three great powers of Europe at the time, but he doesn't really make a lot of headway because he is facing Aratus, and he himself is, as I mentioned, not a good general. I would give Antigonus II a C. I mean, I respect him because of his perseverance. He has to overcome a lot, as I said. And it's pretty impressive that in an era where generalship was so important, that a guy who just outright sucks as a general was able to get as far as he did and firmly establish a dynasty. Especially coming after his father, who was a military adventurer, Pyrrhus, Cassandra. I mean, within living memory, there were a lot of people who were pretty good generals, or at least very active ones. And you got Antigonus, who doesn't know his left foot from his right, and he manages to establish himself as a king. So you got Antigonus II at C, if the tier list thing was working, at least. And now we have his son and successor, Demetrius II. Demetrius II, Aetolicus, well, guess why he gets his name? He kicks a lot of Aetolian ass. He will rule from 239 to 229, but his contributions began a lot before that. He came of age around 260, actually. And because his dad is a bad general, Demetrius II will actually be the chief field commander, and most of the victories that do occur under Antigonus II are actually secured by Demetrius. So he will be the sort of sword arm of his father. Famously, one major victory that he has comes in 260 against Alexander II of Epirus, one of Pyrrhus' sons. He leads an invasion to try to reclaim Macedon, and not only does Demetrius II defeat this invasion, he defeats it very heavily, and at that point, basically, Epirus drops off the map in terms of having any relevance outside of its own borders. So in many ways, Demetrius II ended Epirot history. By 250 or so, he was probably effectively co-ruler, most likely both de jure and de facto. As king, and possibly even starting a little before that, in his campaigns he managed to gain control of Euboea, the rich island off the coast of Attica, which had a lot of rich farmland. He controls Magnesia, he takes control of Thessaly, which means that he fully reunites old Macedon for the first time in a long time. And all was going well in the south. He was breaking the balance of power. He was really crushing the Aetolians and taking land from them and making gains. But then, of course, like many Macedonian kings before him, he has to face the Dardanians up north. Well, not necessarily the Dardanians, but just any group that happens to emerge. And he does do fine in the battle, but unfortunately he dies and leaves a young son, the future Philip V. So that's the end of his career. He was having a brilliant career, but it got cut short. For me, Demetrius II is a solid A. If this guy had lived longer, he most likely would have completely broken the balance of power in the Macedonian world and basically recreated the balance of power as it existed under Philip II. But it didn't quite get to that point because he died a little prematurely. So Philip V is technically king, but he needs a regent because he's underage. So one of Demetrius' cousins, the 42-year-old Antigonus III Docen, also rises to power alongside of Philip V. And apparently his nickname Docen means something like a gift given. And it seems to be ironic because basically he promised to be a loyal regent, but instead became a usurper. So in that sense, he's kind of like the Byzantine Emperor Romanus Lecapenus, or someone like that, who is kind of a gentle usurper. He doesn't steal the throne exactly, but he kind of says he's going to share in it, but then he kind of hogs it. That being said, Antigonus III is fairly successful. He managed to crush a revitalized Sparta under Cleomenes III. So Cleomenes basically had a revolution in Sparta, brought Sparta back to relevance for the first time in decades, and Sparta was starting to really threaten the Achaeans and Aetolians, and then the Macedonians came to the rescue. Antigonus crushes Cleomenes III, and then, as a gesture of his magnanimity, he refrained from sacking Sparta in 222. He then also followed the example of Demetrius II and many previous Macedonian kings by marching north to face an Illyrian invasion. He was successful in the battle, but he was killed in action, or at least mortally wounded, which then left his young ward, Philip V, finally in possession of the throne. Philip V was pretty young still in 221. I think he was maybe 16-ish, something like that. But he was very ambitious. Because of his role in fighting the Romans in a couple of different conflicts, the First and Second Macedonian Wars, and because he reigned from 221 down to 179, Philip V has become a relatively well-known Macedonian ruler and well-studied. The historian Polybius has a lot to say about him because of the accident of survival. A lot of passages in Polybius on Philip V have survived, so we know a great deal about him. Philip V was a pretty good general once he got going, but his specialty was not big pitched field battles. His specialty was kind of small column tactics. So if he was leading small raiding forces, he was really, really good. In pitched battles, he's still okay, but not as good. So during the First Macedonian War, which starts when he's young, the Romans recruit the Aetolians to fight him. Philip had been willing to enter the war on behalf of Hannibal and then invade Italy, but the Romans got him bogged down in Greece with the war against the Aetolians. And during this time, basically, Philip is just bashing the Aetolians and their allies, and Rome is saved from a Macedonian invasion. Philip mostly wins these battles, but ultimately doesn't make a hell of a lot of headway in the end. The war ends in the east, but Rome, of course, is still looking to get even because Philip tried to betray them. By this point, of course, he's now in his prime. He's got a lot of military experience, and he's really established himself as a master of these kind of small column tactics. When the Second Macedonian War begins during the first couple of years, really the first 3 years, Philip wins most of the battles. Most of these battles are small, but Philip realizes that his bench is a lot shallower than Rome's because he knows he's got a lot less manpower. And because his army is still very similar to this Philip and Alexander style army, it requires a lot of training. And one disadvantage that Philip has vis-a-vis his predecessors is that some of those units that Philip and Alexander used to great effect, such as the Agrianes, this group of men who were really good at serving as a go-between between the phalanx and the cavalry on the wings. These men who could march very fast, who came from one of the neighboring groups, they weren't really around anymore, it doesn't seem. So Philip's army, Philip V's army that is, has a little less flexibility, and he's very hesitant about doing head-on battles. Eventually, in 197, he has a massive encounter battle with the Romans on broken terrain at Cynocephaly. This is one of the most famous battles in Roman history, and despite coming very close to victory, Philip V is ultimately defeated by the Romans. And after this, he's forced to agree to a peace. And after that point, in 197, he basically gives up any hope of ever overcoming the Romans, and he even provides them with material support when they fight Antiochus III later on at Magnesia around 191 or so, 190, somewhere in there. He dies in 179 around the age of 59. He had given up a lot of his ambitions. He kind of gave up hope of ever overcoming the Romans because he realized how strong they were. And one of my hot takes on Philip V is that I don't believe Cynocephaly definitively proves the superiority of the legion over the phalanx. A lot of that came down to the creative generalship of the Roman subordinate who attacked in the rear, and also the broken terrain which favored the lighter Romans over the heavier Macedonians. Philip came very close to winning this battle, as the Macedonians would also come very close to winning the Battle of Pydna in 168. So, Philip passes away in 179. He's succeeded by his son Perseus. Perseus was born in 212, so he is already well into adulthood by the time that he comes to power. He is about, 32-ish, 33-ish. And then a war will break out with the Romans, the Third Macedonian War, led famously by Paulus Macedonicus, the son of the famous Paulus who died at Cairneus. By this time, he's a grouchy old man. Perseus sometimes was held to be a coward because he wasn't a super inspiring leader in the front lines in the battles that he fought against the Romans. But part of that is because he got wounded in one of the early engagements, so he was not 100% physically going into this. He was still pretty close to his prime, so had he not been wounded, he would have acquitted himself better. So I think it's unfair to call Perseus a coward. Oh, we got to rate Philip V. Philip V for me is like a D. Perseus, though, sometimes is held to be a coward because he wasn't super involved in a lot of these battles after he got wounded in one of the early engagements. But he did better than he's often given credit for. He fought at Pydna. Once again, he came very close to winning. His army was worse than the one his father had, even if he had revitalized it in numbers at the last minute. So he loses. This leads to the end of the Antigonid dynasty. It also leads to the end of the Macedonian monarchy as such. And Perseus' descendants will then move to Rome, and I think one of his grandsons became a notary. There is another, well, after we rate Perseus, we'll talk about another guy who claimed to be one of his sons. For me, Perseus, I rate a little more favorably than Philip. I put Perseus at a C. His father had kind of dicked things up a little and put him in a bad situation. He did the best he could. He also was fighting wounded. He ultimately lost. I would say it's not his fault. He was massively outmanned. The Romans were the aggressors in the Third Macedonian War. He never had any real chance. Macedon is now divided into 4 republics that are small. And in round 148, when the Romans are fighting another war in the area against the Achaean League this time, because the Achaeans have been their allies, and now they decided that the Achaeans had to go. A man, sometimes called Andrisces, sometimes called Pseudo-Philip, and sometimes called Philip VI, emerged. Most of the sources agree that he was not Perseus' son, like as he claimed. He might have been, who the hell knows. Anyway, he arose, and the Macedonians rose up in revolt under his leadership. He was quickly crushed, and his attempt to revitalize the Macedonian monarchy failed horribly. If I were rating him as one of the spares here, he would be an F. And that is effectively the beginning and end of Macedonian history as explained by the careers of their monarchs, who I intended to tier rank, except that the website refused to cooperate, so we had to do a theoretical tier ranking rather than a visual one. So, that is all I have for you, boys and girls. My cat is now trying to mess with my thing here, my cord. Damn, we got 114 people here. That's a lot. Okay, so let's see who won the book giveaway this week. Unless I'm mistaken, the winner of the book is Diogenes. So Diogenes, be sure to message me on Discord with your mailing address, and I will get your book in the mail. It is one of the low volumes of Demosthenes. Unfortunately, I didn't have an extra of Demosthenes' Olympiacs and Philippics, which would have been the most relevant since Demosthenes was, of course, a virulent hater of Philip II and the Macedonians. But it does include some of his more famous speeches, including against Medius, one of his political rivals. And this volume is in pretty good shape. Actually, it's near perfect. because it was on my desk at work for a long time. So, yeah, you won a lobe tonight, my friend. Congratulations. Be sure to send me your address on Discord, and I will get that in the mail for you. I'm glad all of you were able to show up tonight. We got a pretty good turnout. We got through a lot of Macedonian monarchs. The beginning, of course, was a little rough because the tier ranking thing wasn't working. That threw me off, especially when I was trying to go through those early kings who are pretty difficult to explain because of how they came about in basically Macedonian propaganda. So that is how we did things. Very eventful week, of course, for me. As I mentioned earlier in the stream, one of my intentions for this coming week is to post a video on Constantine the Eighth this week. I'm not sure what else to do. Maybe I'll take out the trash again. Anyhow, thank you all for showing up. Thank you for the super chat, people. And I will catch you next time. Next Sunday, of course, Sean will be back as well. So stay tuned for that. I will announce what we're doing as the week progresses. Peace out, and I hope that you all enjoyed your weekends and have a good week going forward.